The USS Enterprise D had cataloged over 400 anomalous spatial phenomena in its years of service. Captain Jean-Luc Picard had stood on the bridge during encounters with beings of pure energy, with gods who wore mortal faces, with machines that consumed stars, and civilizations that existed outside the boundaries of time itself. He had faced the Borg. He had stood before Q. He had watched the fabric of reality fold and unfold like a letter being read by hands too large to hold it gently. In all of those encounters, in every moment of uncertainty and danger and wonder, there had always been something to hold on to. A sensor reading, a theory, a diplomatic principle, a human instinct sharpened by decades of service. There had always been a framework. The message from the USS Meridian offered no framework. It arrived at 0347 hours, Shia ship's time, during the quiet rotation of Gamma Shift when the Enterprise moved through the Shackleton Expanse at a leisurely warp 6, bound for a scheduled survey of a binary star system designated NGC 4471. The message itself was only 11 seconds long. It had been transmitted on standard Starfleet subspace frequencies, properly encoded, properly signed with Commander Yael Brennan's authorization code. Every technical metric confirmed it was a legitimate distress call from a legitimate Starfleet vessel. The computer had no objection to any of it. But the ensign at the communications console, a young Bolian named Tevo Sarin, who had only been posted to the Enterprise for 4 months, did not wake the captain because of the technical content of the message. He woke the captain because of what was in the background of the transmission. And behind Commander Brennan's voice, behind the clipped urgency of her words, she was saying anomalous contact, crew incapacitated, requesting immediate assistance, coordinates attached. There was a sound that Ensign Oseran could not identify, could not categorize, and could not stop hearing even after the transmission ended. It was not loud. That was the thing that would stay with him for a long time afterward, when he had the luxury of reflection. It was not a roar or an explosion or the shriek of tearing metal. It was low, subsonic in places, bleeding at the edges of perception rather than hitting it directly. It was the kind of sound that you felt in your back teeth and behind your eyes before you consciously registered it as sound at all. It lasted approximately 4 seconds in the background of the 11-second transmission. And in those 4 seconds, Ensign Oseran experienced something he had no clinical term for. Something that his academy training had never addressed. Something that the universal translator rendered not as language, but as a single notation in the ship's linguistic analysis buffer, unclassifiable. Recommends psychological evaluation of receiving personnel. He woke the captain. He felt he had no other choice. Picard arrived on the bridge at 0401 hours, his uniform crisp in that particular way that suggested he had taken 60 seconds more than strictly necessary to compose himself before leaving his quarters. Commander Riker was already there, standing at the upper level of the bridge with his arms folded and his jaw set in the expression that meant he had already listened to the transmission and was processing something he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. Counselor Troy sat in her chair to the left of the captain's seat, and the moment Picard stepped through the turbo-lift doors, he noticed that her hands were folded very carefully in her lap, the knuckles slightly pale. "Report," he said, settling into his chair with the calm of long practice. "USS Meridian, Captain," Data said from Ops, his golden eyes scanning his console with the particular rapid efficiency that meant he was running multiple analyses simultaneously. "Oberth-class science vessel, crew complement 43, or dispatched 6 weeks ago on a long-range subspace resonance survey of the Shackleton Expanse periphery. Their last routine check-in was 31 hours ago. No anomalies reported at that time." He paused for precisely 0.3 seconds, which for Data was a meaningful hesitation. The distress transmission was sent approximately 4 hours after that check-in. "What were they surveying specifically?" Picard asked. "Subspace resonance mapping," Data replied. "The survey was designed to catalog natural subspace frequency variations in this region, which Starfleet science believes may be linked to the unusual warp field instabilities reported by several vessels operating near the Expanse boundary over the past 2 years." Commander Brennan's team was using a modified long-range resonance emitter to actively ping subspace layers at varying frequencies and record the return signatures. He paused again. "I have been analyzing the passive sensor data the Meridian was transmitting automatically during their survey. Approximately 6 hours before the distress call, their emitter produced a frequency in a subspace band that Federation science has not previously documented. Meaning, Riker asked. Meaning, Data said carefully, that we do not know what that frequency band is connected to, what it propagates through, or what, if anything, might be sensitive to it. He turned from his console to look at the captain directly. What I can say is that the frequency in question bears no resemblance to any natural subspace phenomenon in our records. Its mathematical structure is, in several respects that I find difficult to articulate precisely, inconsistent with what our models predict subspace is capable of generating or sustaining. The bridge was quiet for a moment. The hum of the ship's systems filled the silence the way it always did. Steady, reassuring, the sound of 10,000 working components maintaining the envelope of survivability that separated everyone on board from the void outside. You're saying it shouldn't exist, Riker said. I am saying that our models suggest it should not exist, Data replied. That is not the same thing. However, it is cause for methodological caution. Picard turned to Troy. She had been quiet since he sat down, which was itself informative. Counselor, you've listened to the transmission. Yes, she said. Her voice was even, professionally modulated, but there was something underneath it that Picard had learned over years to recognize. Not fear exactly, but the careful containment of an emotion she hadn't yet classified. Commander Brennan's emotional state during the transmission was consistent with controlled panic. She was frightened, but she was functioning, making a deliberate choice to transmit, to articulate coordinates, to follow protocol. That's significant. Whatever she encountered, her mind was still her own when she sent that message. And the sound in the background? Picard asked. Troy's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I don't know what that was, she said, empathically, and I want to be precise here, because I think precision matters. It didn't feel like an emotion. It felt like the space where an emotion should be. Like a frequency that the empathic sense reaches toward and finds nothing recognizable. Not absence, not void. Something that the mind keeps trying to interpret and cannot. Lieutenant Worf straightened at his tactical station. Captain, I recommend we approach at yellow alert. If a Starfleet vessel has been incapacitated, we should assume an unknown hostile presence until we have evidence otherwise. Agreed, Picard said. Yellow alert. Increase to warp 8. Time to intercept? At warp 8, approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes, Data reported. Very well. Picard settled back in his chair. Data, I want everything the Federation has on anomalous subspace frequencies in this region. Worf, we review the Meridian's technical specifications. I want to know exactly what their resonance emitter was capable of and what frequency bands it could theoretically access. Counselor, get some rest before we arrive. I suspect you're going to need it. He paused, looking at the view screen, at the familiar rush of stars stretching into the blue-white lines of warp travel. And someone pull the background sound from that transmission and run it through every analytical filter we have. I have already begun that process, Data said. However, Captain, I should note that the Universal Translator's linguistic analysis returned an unusual notation. I saw it in the brief, Picard said. Unclassifiable. Yes, but there is a secondary notation that was not included in the duty officer's summary. Data looked at his console. One, the translator's pattern recognition subroutine, which normally identifies whether a sound is biological, mechanical, or environmental in origin, returned a result I have not previously encountered in my service. Which was? Data turned to face him fully. It returned no category, he said. Not an error, not an unknown. The subroutine ran correctly and returned a deliberate null result, as though the sound did not fit within the ontological framework the translator uses to classify what a sound is. He tilted his head slightly. I found it curious enough to flag. Picard held Data's gaze for a moment. Around them, the bridge crew continued their work, but with a particular kind of careful focus. The focus of people who have heard something they cannot explain and chosen, professionally, to keep moving forward anyway. Noted. Mr. Data, Picard said quietly. Keep working on it. The Enterprise accelerated through the dark, toward a ship full of people who had heard something the universe apparently had no category for. Ahead, in the deep survey lanes of the Shackleton Expanse, something that had been moving for longer than the Federation had existed, continued moving, unhurried and immense, through the spaces between what was known and what was not. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The USS Meridian was found exactly where Commander Brennan's coordinates indicated, drifting in a slow, unpowered rotation approximately 0.3 light-years from the nearest charted stellar body. A dim, unremarkable red dwarf that cast almost no useful light across this stretch of the expanse. The science vessel turned end over end with the patient, indifferent motion of something that had been abandoned mid-thought, its running lights dark, its warp nacelles cold, its deflector dish producing none of the characteristic blue luminescence that indicated even standby power. From a distance through the Enterprise's main view screen, it looked like a toy that a child had set down and forgotten. It looked, Picard thought, with a discipline that he did not allow to reach his face, profoundly wrong. Not damaged. That was the first thing that struck him, and he could see from the subtle shift in Riker's posture that his first officer had registered the same thing. A vessel that had been attacked showed evidence of the attack. Scorched hull plating, breached sections venting atmosphere, the characteristic bloom of structural damage around impact points. The Meridian showed none of that. Its hull was completely intact. Every external component that was visible on sensors appeared undamaged. The ship had not been fired upon, had not struck anything, had not experienced any detectable catastrophic system failure. Its warp core had simply stopped. Its power systems had simply stopped. It floated in the dark like a stopped clock, perfect and useless, as though whatever had happened to it had occurred not to the ship, but to the intention behind the ship. As though something had reached past the machinery and switched off the will that kept it running. Full stop, Picard said. Hold position at 500 kilometers. Holding, Ensign Rowe confirmed from the con. Worf, tactical scan. Scanning. Worf's fingers moved across his console with the practiced precision of someone who had learned to let professionalism absorb unease. No weapon signatures detected, no energy discharges, no evidence of external impact on the hull. Power readings are, he paused. Captain, I am reading trace power in the Meridian's life support systems only. Emergency battery reserves, atmosphere is intact throughout the ship. Temperature is dropping. Currently 11 degrees Celsius ship-wide and falling approximately 1 degree every 40 minutes. So they're alive, Riker said. Life signs? Picard asked. 41 confirmed life signs, data reported from Ops, all located on decks 2 through 4, one which is consistent with the crew having gathered or been gathered in the central habitation sections. Biosigns are another of those meaningful pauses. They are alive, Captain. Cardiovascular function, respiration, neurological activity. But the neurological readings are unusual. Brainwave patterns across all 41 individuals are consistent with a state that does not correspond to sleep, unconsciousness, or any cataloged neurological condition in the Federation medical database. They are not in comas. They are not asleep. Their minds are active. He looked up from his console. They appear to be aware, but they are not moving and they are not responding to the automated hailing signal I have been broadcasting on the Meridian's internal comm system for the past 4 minutes. The bridge sat with that for a moment. Eero 41, Riker said quietly. The Meridian's complement is 43. Yes, Data said. I am unable to locate 2 members of the crew. There are no life signs corresponding to them anywhere aboard the vessel. There is also no evidence of transporter activity, hull breach, or any mechanism by which they might have left the ship. He paused. They are simply not present. Troy made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath, and Picard turned to look at her. She was sitting very still, her eyes focused somewhere past the view screen, past the drifting hulk of the Meridian, past the darkness beyond it. Her expression was the expression of someone listening to something at the very edge of audibility. Counselor, he said carefully. There's something out there, she said. Her voice was quiet and precise, in the way that voices became when their owner was concentrating very hard on not allowing them to shake. Not on the ship, beyond it. I can't, it's not an emotion. I said that before, about the transmission, and I want to maintain that assessment because I think it's important. It is not an emotion, but it is a presence. Something that the empathic sense reaches toward the way your eye reaches toward movement in peripheral vision. She paused. And the harder I reach toward it, the less I find. as though the act of perception itself causes it to recede. Distance? Riker asked. Direction? That's what I can't give you, Troy said, and there was a note of genuine frustration in her voice, a counselor's frustration at the limits of her own instrument. Direction implies that it exists in a location. I'm not certain it does, in the way we normally mean. Worf turned from his tactical station. Captain, I recommend against sending an away team until we have a clearer picture of the threat environment. Whatever incapacitated 41 trained Starfleet personnel and removed 2 others without leaving a trace may still be in the vicinity. Noted, Mr. Worf. Picard stood, straightening his uniform jacket with the small, reflexive gesture that meant a decision had been made. However, there are 41 people on that ship in a deteriorating life support situation. We cannot leave them there while we deliberate. He turned to Riker. Number 1, you'll lead the away team. Dr. Crusher, Data, Worf, full environmental suits. I want everyone protected against whatever atmospheric or biological anomaly might have affected the crew. A tricorder set to maximum sensitivity across all spectrums. He paused. And I want a transporter lock maintained on every member of the team at all times. Any reading that suggests a threat, you beam back immediately. No heroics. Riker smiled very slightly. Understood, Captain. The Meridian's corridors were cold and dark and perfectly unsettlingly intact. Away teams experienced damaged ships regularly enough that there was a kind of professional grammar to it. The crunch of debris underfoot, the flicker of emergency lighting through smoke or venting gas, the sounds of damaged systems cycling and failing. It was unpleasant, but it was comprehensible. The Meridian offered none of that comprehensibility. The corridors were exactly as they should be, every panel in place, every junction sealed, every surface clean, as though the crew had simply paused their day mid-step and stood very still. Equipment lay where it had been set down rather than where it had been dropped. A coffee cup sat on a console in the corridor junction at Deck 3, still upright, its contents cold but unspilled. This is unsettling, Dr. Crusher said, her voice low, her medical tricorder sweeping continuously as she moved. Confirmed, Data said, which was not the kind of thing Data usually said about unsettling things, and which therefore was itself unsettling. They found the crew on Deck 3, in the main laboratory and the 2 adjoining corridors. All 41 of them, seated, standing, crouched, in whatever position they had occupied when whatever had happened had happened. Their eyes were open. Their breathing was slow and regular. Their skin was warm. So when Crusher knelt beside a young ensign sitting against the corridor wall, his knees drawn up to his chest and his hands resting open and upward in his lap, his eyes tracked her movement. He saw her. He simply did not respond. Neurological activity is elevated, not suppressed, Crusher said, her voice shifting into the focused clinical register of active diagnosis. It's as though every cognitive resource is being directed, consumed. He's thinking actively with enormous intensity, but none of it is translating into motor output or communication. She looked up. It's like every conscious process is occupied with something else entirely. What could do this? Riker asked. Nothing in my medical database, Crusher said flatly, and I've checked twice. Worf had moved ahead of the group, his tricorder in one hand and his phaser in the other, sweeping the laboratory with the thoroughness of someone who trusted methodology when instinct was producing nothing useful. The lab was where the Meridian's survey equipment was housed. The long-range resonance emitter array, the subspace mapping consoles, the data recording systems. Most of it was dark, powered down with everything else. But one screen was still active, running on whatever reserve power the system had managed to retain. It displayed a single image, a sensor rendering, the computer's attempt to construct a visual representation of whatever the Meridian's external sensors had detected before they went offline. Worf looked at it for a long moment. Then he said very carefully, "Commander Riker." Riker crossed the lab and stood beside him and looked at the screen. And the sensor rendering was incomplete. Starfleet sensors were extraordinarily sophisticated instruments, capable of resolving objects at ranges and scales that would have seemed miraculous to any pre-warp civilization, capable of distinguishing individual molecules at close range and mapping stellar bodies at light-year distances. They were, in every measurable sense, among the most capable perception tools that Federation science had produced, and they had tried. The rendering showed that they had tried. Multiple scan passes overlaid on each other, each one attempting to build on the last, each one adding data, refining the image, reaching toward a complete picture. None of them had achieved it, not because the sensors had failed, because the thing they were scanning was too large. Not large in the way that a Borg cube was large, or a gas giant, or a nebula. Those things were large within a framework that sensors could encompass, could bracket, could establish boundaries around. This was large in a way that the sensors kept attempting to find the edges of and kept failing. Every scan pass that tried to establish where the thing ended simply found more of it and redirected inward, searching for a center that may not have existed in any conventional spatial sense. What the rendering showed, in its incomplete and cascading and deeply inadequate way, was a shape that was also a direction, that was also a distance. Something that was vertical in the way that a concept was vertical, rather than in the way that a physical object was vertical. Something with a suggestion of a head, when if a head could be defined as the place where a thing's relationship to perception was most concentrated. Something that moved, the sensor timestamps confirmed, but moved in a way that produced no displacement of surrounding space. No gravitational signature, no subspace wake, no thermal output, no electromagnetic emission. Nothing. A shape that moved through space and left nothing behind it and took nothing with it and had no detectable relationship to the physics of the universe it was moving through, except for 41 catatonic crew members and 2 people who were simply gone. Riker looked at the image for a long time. Beside him, Worf said nothing, which was itself a kind of statement. "Data," Riker said finally. "I want a full copy of every sensor log the Meridian recorded in the 6 hours before this image was captured. Everything. Raw data. Unprocessed." "Understood," Data said from across the laboratory. "And Data." Riker did not look away from the screen. That frequency the Meridian was broadcasting. The one that shouldn't exist. "Yes, Commander. Make absolutely certain the Enterprise is not broadcasting anything in that range." A pause. "I will verify immediately," Data said, and there was something in his voice, not quite alarm, for Data did not do alarm, but a quality of heightened priority that communicated the same thing alarm would have. Riker tapped his comm badge. "Riker to Enterprise. Picard here. Captain." Riker looked one more time at the sensor rendering on the dark screen, at the shape that was too large to be real and too present to be dismissed. "We're going to need more time down here. And I think you should see what we're looking at." He paused. "I'm going to send you a sensor image. I'd recommend sitting down first." The cold laboratory hummed with the sound of failing systems. Outside in the dark between stars, in the space that sensors kept trying and failing to fully perceive, something continued its passage through the Shackleton Expanse. It had not acknowledged the Enterprise's presence. It had not acknowledged anything. It simply moved, as it had always moved, as it would continue to move, through a universe that had not yet developed the adequate language for what it was. The sensor image arrived on the Enterprise's main view screen at 0847 hours, and for approximately 4 seconds, no one on the bridge said anything at all. Picard stood in front of his command chair and looked at it. He was a man who had trained himself over decades of deep space service to receive information without flinching, to absorb the unexpected and respond to it with the measured, considered calm that command required. He had looked at Borg cubes on that view screen. He had watched stars go nova. He had seen through those same sensors the geometric perfection of a crystalline entity consuming a colony world. He understood intellectually and experientially that the universe contained things that were large, and things that were dangerous and things that defied easy categorization. He had built a career on meeting those things with reason and inquiry and the fundamental Federation belief that understanding was always preferable to fear. He looked at the sensor image from the Meridian and felt, in some deep and honest part of himself, that command discipline could not entirely reach, that his framework for what the universe was permitted to contain had just been quietly, irrevocably revised. The image was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to dismiss. It was not wrong in its content, or rather, its content was wrong in a way that went beyond simple strangeness. Picard had seen strange things on view screens. Strange was a category he was comfortable with. This was something else. The sensor rendering produced by the Meridian's computers was the visual equivalent of a sentence that was grammatically correct but semantically incoherent. All the components were present and in the right relationship to each other, but the thing they assembled into had no referent in any framework that a human mind had been built to process. It was too vertical. That was the only way his mind kept approaching it, kept trying to anchor it. Too vertical, as though verticality were not a spatial property, but a philosophical one. As though the thing existed in a dimension that human perception processed as up and down, because up and down was the closest available translation, the way the universal translator reached for the nearest equivalent word when the precise one did not exist in the target language. And it was large in a way that made the word large feel embarrassed to be used. Data, Picard said, when he trusted his voice to be level. Analysis. Data had beamed back from the Meridian with the full raw sensor archive and had been processing it for 11 minutes. He stood at his ops station with both hands moving across the console in the rapid, flowing motion of simultaneous computation, his golden eyes flicking between 3 separate analysis windows. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular careful quality of an intelligence that had encountered something it found genuinely difficult to resolve. I have completed a preliminary analysis of the Meridian's full sensor archive, Data said. I will present my findings in order of confidence, beginning with what I am most certain of and proceeding toward what I find most uncertain, as the gradient between those 2 points is, in this case, unusually steep. He paused. What I am most certain of, the object detected by the Meridian's sensors is physically present in this region of space. It has mass in the sense that it occupies volume. It moves in the sense that its position changes over time. These are not in dispute. And what you're less certain of? Riker asked. He had beamed back from the Meridian 15 minutes ago and was standing to Picard's right, his arms folded, his expression carrying the specific controlled tension of someone who had seen something in person and was now watching others encounter it for the first time. Everything else, Data said, with a directness that under other circumstances might have been almost comic. The object, I will continue to use that word for the sake of grammatical convenience, and though I want to note that I do not believe it is fully accurate, does not interact with the surrounding space in any way consistent with an object of its apparent mass. There is no gravitational signature, no subspace displacement, no thermal emission, no electromagnetic output of any frequency. When the Meridian sensors attempted to take a complete reading, each scan pass returned data that was internally consistent but mutually contradictory, as though the object's properties changed depending on the method used to observe them. He looked at Picard. I have encountered sensor interference, sensor malfunction, deliberate sensor masking, and phenomena that our instruments were not designed to detect. This does not match any of those categories. The sensors are functioning correctly. The readings are accurate. They simply describe something that should not be able to exist. And yet it does, Picard said quietly. And yet it does, Data agreed. There is one additional finding that I believe warrants particular attention. In reviewing the Meridian sensor logs chronologically, I identified the moment at which the object first appeared within sensor range. It did not arrive. It did not emerge from warp or from a spatial anomaly or from any detectable transition point. The sensor logs show empty space, and then on the next scan cycle, 1.3 seconds later, the object is present. As though it had always been there, and the sensors had only just achieved the correct parameters to perceive it. He paused. Or as though it had stepped into the range of perception from somewhere that sensors do not cover. Troy, one who had been silent in her chair since the image appeared on the view screen, spoke without turning her head. It's still there, she said. I can feel it. The same quality as before. The presence that recedes when you reach toward it. But stronger now. Much stronger. She paused. I think it's closer. Confirmed, Worf said immediately, his voice dropping to the register it used when threat assessment was transitioning from theoretical to operational. Captain, I am detecting... He stopped. His hands moved across his console with quick precision. I am detecting a marginal change in the Enterprise's passive sensor readings in the bearing consistent with the Meridian's sensor image. Not an energy signature, not a mass reading. He stopped again, visibly frustrated by the inadequacy of the available vocabulary. An occlusion? I.e., as though something is between us and the stars in that direction. Something that is not producing any sensor return, but is nevertheless blocking what is behind it. Picard turned to look at the view screen. The Meridian still drifted in its slow, indifferent rotation at 500 kilometers. Beyond it, the red dwarf cast its dim and useful light across exactly the same arrangement of distant stars that had been there when they arrived. Nothing had changed. Nothing was visibly different. And yet, magnify, Picard said. Maximum optical resolution. That bearing. The view screen shifted, the image tightening, the stars in that sector of space pulling closer into focus, with the crystal clarity of the Enterprise's optical sensors operating at their peak. Stars, dust, the faint smear of a distant nebula. The cold and ordinary darkness of deep space, and then at the absolute edge of what optical magnification could resolve, something that the stars bent around. Not dramatically, not in the way that gravitational lensing bent light around a sufficiently massive object, that produced a characteristic arc, a predictable curve, a distortion that followed known physics. This was different. The stars at the very periphery of that region of space were simply slightly wrong. Their positions were off by margins that were individually within sensor error tolerance, but that, when taken together across the entire field, described a shape, an outline, the ghost of a silhouette that existed not as a thing that was visible, but as the place where visibility had decided not to apply. My God, Crusher said softly. She had come to the bridge when the away team returned and was standing near the science station, her medical tricorder still in her hand from the Meridian, forgotten. It is not a god, Data said, and then paused, though I acknowledge that the distinction may be, in practical terms, less significant than I would prefer. Picard absorbed this. He absorbed it with the full force of every discipline he had accumulated across 30 years of Starfleet service. Every lesson in composure and analysis and the fundamental methodology of meeting the unknown with a scientist's curiosity rather than a primitive's terror. He absorbed it and he set it in order, and he looked at it clearly and without flinching. How large? He asked. Data took 2.7 seconds to answer, which was, for Data, the equivalent of a very long silence. Based on the angular occlusion data, my best current estimate is that the object is between 60 and 90 kilometers in height. He paused. I want to note, however, that this estimate assumes the object has a defined upper boundary that my sensors have been able to locate. I am not fully confident that assumption is correct. The bridge was very quiet. The hum of the ship's systems continued its steady, reassuring, suddenly very small sound. It is not moving toward us, Worf said, with the careful precision of someone offering the most positive, available piece of information. It is moving, he checked his console. It is moving in a direction that is difficult to characterize as any standard navigational bearing. As though its path does not correspond to the spatial geometry our navigation systems use. Like it's walking, Riker said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, with the tone of a man who had found the right word and wished he hadn't. No one disagreed with him. Picard turned away from the view screen and moved to the science station, pulling up Data's analysis on the secondary display. His mind was moving now with the focused, methodical energy that it always found in moments of genuine crisis, not the adrenaline-driven urgency of combat or the reactive problem-solving of a system failure, but the deep structural engagement of a man whose most fundamental instinct was to understand. He scrolled through Data's preliminary findings, through the sensor contradictions and the measurement anomalies and the cascading null results. And he thought about what he knew and what he didn't know and what the shape of his ignorance suggested. We need to understand what happened to the Meridian's crew, he said. Specifically, we need to understand the mechanism, whether it was proximity, whether it was some form of emission, whether it was related to the frequency they were broadcasting. He looked at Crusher. Beverly, the 41 crew members are aboard now? In sickbay, and 2 of the holosuites we've converted to overflow medical space, Crusher confirmed. All stable, all in the same neurological state. I have 3 diagnostic programs running, and I've opened a consultation channel with Starfleet Medical. They've never seen anything like it either. She paused. The 2 missing crew members, I've been thinking about that. There's no biological residue anywhere on the Meridian. No evidence of any physical process that would account for their absence. It's as though they were... She stopped, choosing her next word with visible care. Collected, she said finally. As though they were collected. The words settled over the bridge like a temperature drop. Worf, Picard said. I want a full defensive posture. Raise shields, arm all phaser banks, load torpedo tubes. I want our fastest possible response time if the situation changes. Aye, Captain. Worf moved to comply with the particular satisfying efficiency of someone whose recommendation had finally been adopted. Data. Picard turned to face his operations officer fully. The frequency the Meridian was broadcasting, the one that drew this, whatever this is, here. I want to know everything that frequency represents. I want to know what it propagates through, what it's connected to, and whether there is any way to reverse it, to uninvite what it invited. I am already working on that analysis, Data said. However, Captain, I must be transparent with you about the scale of the challenge. The frequency in question exists in a subspace band that Federation science has never documented. I am constructing my analysis from first principles, without the benefit of prior research, comparative data, or theoretical framework. I will find answers, but I cannot estimate a reliable timeline for doing so. Understood, Picard said. Do your best. He paused, looking once more at the view screen, at the dark and the drifting Meridian, and the place in the star field where the stars bent slightly wrong. And Data, the two missing crew members from the Meridian. Run every possible scan you can conceive of, every spectrum, every methodology, every theoretical framework you have access to. You want to know where they are, Data said. I want to know if they're still... Picard paused. I want to know if there is anything to find. Data held his gaze. I will look, he said. Outside in the space that the sensors kept failing to fully describe, the giants moved along whatever path they moved along, through whatever geometry governed them, with the patient and absolute indifference of something that had never been required to notice the things around it. The Enterprise sat in the dark with its shields raised and its weapons armed, and its crew of 1,000 souls working with brilliant, determined, even entirely inadequate urgency to understand what was walking among them. In the converted holosuites that now served as overflow medical wards, 41 people sat and stood and crouched with their eyes open and their minds entirely occupied, looking at something that no one else could see. Starfleet Command received Picard's full situation report at 11:34 hours, transmitted via Priority 1 subspace channel with a security classification that automatically routed it past standard intake processing and directly to the desk of Admiral Elena Nechayev at Starfleet Operations. The report included Data's preliminary sensor analysis, Crusher's neurological findings on the Meridian crew, the recovered sensor image, and Picard's own assessment, characteristically precise, characteristically understated, and, in its understatement, more alarming than any amount of dramatic language could have been. Nechayev read it twice. Then she convened an emergency session of the Starfleet Science Advisory Board. Then she did something that Picard, had he known about it, would have found deeply instructive about how seriously Starfleet Command was taking the situation. She contacted Section 31. She did not know that she was contacting Section 31. She believed she was contacting a classified Starfleet Intelligence Analytical Division designated only by a file number, which had been brought to her attention 2 years earlier by an admiral she trusted and which had, on 3 subsequent occasions, provided threat assessments of unusual accuracy and unusual cost. She transmitted the situation report to that file number and received a response in 40 minutes that was thorough, unhelpful, and deeply unsettling in the particular way that responses were unsettling when they demonstrated that the person writing them already knew things they should not have known. The response said, in its careful and bureaucratic language, that the phenomena described in Captain Picard's report were consistent with a category of anomalous spatial entities that had been theorized but never confirmed in Federation scientific literature, that the theoretical framework for such entities suggested they were not susceptible to conventional deterrence or containment, and that Starfleet's recommended response was observation and non-engagement pending further analysis. It did not say what the theoretical framework was based on. It did not say who had theorized these entities or when. It did not explain why a classified intelligence division had a pre-existing theoretical framework for something that Picard's report described as entirely unprecedented. Nechayev noted these omissions. She filed them in the part of her mind reserved for things she would return to when the immediate crisis permitted. Then she transmitted her orders to the Enterprise. Picard read the orders at 12:03 hours in his ready room, with a cup of Earl Grey going cold on his desk and the particular expression on his face that Riker, who had been summoned to hear the orders alongside him, she privately thought of as the expression, the one that meant the captain had received information from command that was simultaneously insufficient and overreaching, and that he was deciding, with great deliberateness, how to respond to it. Maintain position, Picard read aloud. Observe and document. Do not attempt contact. Do not attempt engagement. Await the arrival of a Starfleet science vessel, the USS Pasteur, which has been redirected to your coordinates and will arrive in approximately 18 hours. The Pasteur carries specialized sensor equipment and a xenobiological research team with relevant expertise. He set the PADD down. Relevant expertise, he repeated, with a careful neutrality that communicated exactly what he thought of that phrase. They knew, Riker said. It was not a question. Something was known, Picard said. Whether the people giving these orders are the same people who knew it, I cannot say, but someone in the chain that produced these orders had prior information about what we're dealing with. The response time is too fast, the language too specific. You don't develop the phrase relevant expertise in 40 minutes. And the Pasteur is 18 hours away, Riker said, which means 18 hours of sitting here watching something that already took 2 members of the Meridian's crew. Yes. Picard stood, moving to the viewport behind his desk. The stars were stationary. They had dropped out of warp upon finding the Meridian and had not moved since. Somewhere in the dark outside, the giants continued their incomprehensible passage. I have no intention of simply waiting, number one. But I also have no intention of provoking a confrontation with something we don't yet understand on the basis of incomplete information against explicit orders. What I intend to do is use the next 18 hours as productively as possible. Data's analysis, Riker said. Data's analysis. Beverly's work with the Meridian crew. If we can find any way to reach them, to understand what they're experiencing, that could be more valuable than anything our sensors tell us. And Counselor Troy. He turned from the viewport. She's our most sensitive instrument right now. Whatever she can perceive about this presence, its nature, its intent, if intent is even a concept that applies, I want it documented with the greatest possible precision. Riker nodded slowly. And if it comes closer? If it moves toward the ship? Picard held his gaze. Then we will make decisions appropriate to the situation as it exists at that time, he said. Not before. Data worked. This was not unusual. Data always worked, in the sense that his positronic brain maintained continuous processing across hundreds of parallel analytical threads regardless of what his physical form was doing. But there was a quality to his engagement with the Meridian's sensor data that was different from his normal analytical operations. A quality that he noted with the same careful, curious attention he gave to all novel internal states. It was not frustration, though it contained some of frustration's functional characteristics. It was not confusion, though the data was deeply, genuinely confusing. It was something more fundamental, a recognition, building with each analysis cycle, certain that the tools he was using to examine the problem were themselves products of the framework the problem was violating. He was trying to measure something with instruments that had been built on the assumption that the thing being measured would cooperate with the measuring. And it did not cooperate. Not actively, not aggressively. It simply proceeded according to whatever principles governed it, and those principles had no interest in being legible to Federation sensor technology. He had run 47 separate analytical approaches in the 3 hours since returning from the Meridian. 47 approaches, and what he had accumulated was not a growing picture, but a growing map of his own ignorance. An increasingly detailed chart of all the ways in which the giants defied characterization. He knew what they were not. He knew, with extraordinary precision and in extraordinary detail, the complete inventory of things that could not explain them. He had eliminated one by one every natural phenomenon, every known anomalous entity, every theoretical construct in the Federation's scientific literature that might have accounted for what the Meridian sensors had recorded. What remained after 47 approaches and 3 hours of elimination was a category that Federation science did not have a word for, a category that his analysis was constructing in real time from negative space, defined entirely by the borders of everything it was not. Here he was in the process of formulating a 48th approach when Lieutenant Commander LaForge arrived at the science lab with 2 cups of something hot and the expression of a man who had been thinking about a problem from a different angle. "Tell me what you have," Geordi said, setting one of the cups near Data's workspace with the easy familiarity of long collaboration, pulling up a stool and looking at the analysis displays with the focused attention that his visor translated into a slightly different quality of gaze than a biological eye would produce. Data told him. Comprehensively, precisely, and without editorializing, he laid out 47 approaches and 47 failures in the shape of the category they had collectively failed to fill. Geordi listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Data had always valued about working with him, the capacity to receive a complete picture before beginning to respond to it. When Data finished, Geordi was quiet for a moment. He picked up his cup and turned it in his hands and looked at the primary display showing the most recent sensor rendering, the image that kept failing to be complete. "You're approaching this as a physics problem," Geordi said. "It is a physics problem," Data said, "or it should be. Everything physical is, by definition, a physics problem." "Right, but..." Geordi set the cup down and leaned forward, pointing at the display. "Look at what the sensors are actually doing. Every scan pass, they're trying to establish boundary conditions. They want to find where the thing starts and where it stops, what it's made of, how it interacts with its environment. That's how our sensors work. They're built to find edges and interactions." He paused. "What if this thing doesn't have edges in any way our sensors are designed to look for? What if it's not that the sensors are failing to find the edges? It's that the edges don't exist in the dimensions our sensors are looking in?" Data processed this. "You are suggesting a higher dimensional topology," he said. "I'm suggesting that what we're seeing..." Geordi tapped the display, the outline of the occluded starfield, the shape defined by the absence of correct light, might be a cross-section. Like, imagine a 3-dimensional object passing through a 2-dimensional plane. The 2-dimensional observers would see a cross-section that appears, changes shape, and then disappears. Where they could never see the whole object, because the whole object exists in a dimension they don't have access to. The 2-dimensional observers, Data said slowly, would find the cross-section's behavior anomalous. It would appear to have no mass in 2 dimensions, no consistent boundary. Its apparent shape would change in ways that seemed to follow no 2-dimensional physical law." He looked at Geordi, because the law it was following was 3-dimensional. "And we," Geordi said quietly, "are the 2-dimensional observers." The science lab was very still for a moment. Through the hull, somewhere in the dark, the giants moved along dimensions that Federation mathematics had theorized but never confirmed, and what the Enterprise's sensors saw was the cross-section, the fragment of presence that happened to intersect the 3-dimensional space that human and Starfleet instruments were capable of perceiving. The thing that was 60 to 90 kilometers tall was not the giants. It was the shadow of the giants cast in dimensions too small to contain the reality. "This changes the analysis significantly," Data said. "It changes everything," Geordi said. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded the way people sounded when they had found the correct answer to a question, and the correct answer was worse than the incorrect ones. If they exist primarily in higher dimensions, and we're only seeing a cross-section, then our sensors are never going to give us a complete picture. Nor our weapons, if we were ever considering weapons, would be like trying to stop a charging rhinoceros by shooting at its shadow. Our shields might not interact with them at all, because they might be able to step through our shield geometry the same way a 3-dimensional object steps through a 2-dimensional barrier. "And the 2 missing crew members from the Meridian," Data said. Geordi looked at him. "If something that exists in higher dimensions were to interact with a 3-dimensional organism," Data said carefully, "the organism might be displaced from 3-dimensional space without any evidence of the mechanism from a 3-dimensional observational standpoint. They would simply cease to be present in the dimensions we can observe." He paused. "Whether they continued to exist in dimensions we cannot observe is a question I cannot currently answer." Geordi was quiet for a long time. "We need to tell the captain," he said. "Yes," Data agreed. He was already composing the briefing, arranging the findings in the order most likely to be useful rather than most likely to be distressing. which was a distinction that in this case required considerable thought. I am also going to need to revise my sensor approach entirely. If we are to observe a cross-section of a higher dimensional entity, rather than attempting to observe the entity directly, the parameters are different. We may be able to learn significantly more. He paused. About the cross-section, about the shadow. Not about what's casting it, Geordi said. No, Data said. Swana, not about what is casting it. He looked at the display one more time, at the shape defined by absent light, at the place in space where the stars bent wrong. Though I find myself, and I want to be precise about this, Geordi, because I am not certain the word is correct, I find myself, for the first time in my operational experience, not entirely certain that I want to. Geordi looked at his friend carefully. In 7 years of working alongside Data, across dozens of anomalies and crises and genuinely terrifying encounters, he had never heard him say anything like that. He picked up his cup. It had gone cold. Yeah, he said quietly. Me neither. The Klingon vessel decloaked at 1547 hours, with the characteristic shimmer of a bird of prey dropping its cloaking device. That particular ripple in space that Worf's tactical sensors were calibrated to detect at ranges that would have surprised its designers. It materialized off the Enterprise's port bow at approximately 800 kilometers, close enough to be a statement and far enough to avoid being an act of aggression, which suggested its commander understood the distinction and had chosen the distance deliberately. It was a Brel-class scout, running configuration, its wing-mounted disruptors in the lowered position that indicated readiness without commitment. Its hull markings identified it as the IKS Durasetlo, a name that translated roughly in as the blade that remembers, and it broadcast on standard Klingon military frequencies with the directness that characterized Klingon communication when it was not being deliberately theatrical. Federation vessel. The voice that came across the channel was a woman's, deep and measured, with a particular quality of authority that did not need volume to establish itself. I am Captain Korath, daughter of Marek of the House of Toreth. You are sitting in space that is about to become very interesting. I suggest we talk. Worf straightened at his tactical station with the particular complex tension of a Klingon who had spent enough years in Starfleet to have genuinely internalized its protocols and enough years as a Klingon to feel the pull of a different set of instincts. He ran the identification against the Klingon military database that the Enterprise maintained under the terms of the Khitomer Accords. Captain Korath is confirmed, he said. Veteran of the Cardassian border conflicts, decorated. Her house has a reputation for unconventional tactical thinking. Meaning? Riker asked. Meaning that she wins in ways her superiors find difficult to officially commend, Worf said, with a note in his voice that suggested he found this admirable. Picard had already moved to the command area. On screen, he said. Korath was perhaps 50 by Klingon reckoning, which placed her in what the species considered the fullness of physical and strategic capability, past the recklessness of youth and before the calculation heaviness of old age. Her ridges were pronounced, her hair pulled back with severe practicality, and she wore her captain's sash with the ease of something that had become part of her body rather than an article of clothing. She looked at Picard with the direct, assessing gaze of someone taking an inventory that had nothing to do with hostility. Captain Picard, she said, your reputation is known to me. I did not expect to find the Enterprise sitting still. Captain Korath, Picard replied, with the careful courtesy that he gave to every first contact regardless of its circumstances. I confess I did not expect company. What brings a Klingon scout to the Shackleton Expanse? The same thing that brought you, Korath said. We detected the resonance frequency the small Federation vessel was broadcasting 11 days ago from our patrol route near the Expanse boundary. We have been tracking what it attracted ever since. She paused and something moved across her face. Not fear, because Picard did not think Korath was a woman who experienced fear in any conventional sense, but a quality of profound, considered gravity. We have been following it for 11 days, Picard. We have watched it move. We have attempted to scan it. We have attempted to understand it. Another pause longer. I am here because I have run out of frameworks for what I am seeing, and I have been told that Starfleet science is occasionally useful for things that Klingon warriors are not. It was, Picard understood immediately, an extraordinary admission. The Klingon captain of Korath's standing and reputation did not cross into Federation space and request scientific assistance without having exhausted every alternative and having made a very deliberate calculation about the cost of the admission versus the cost of proceeding without it. He felt a measured respect settle into his assessment of her. "You've been observing them for 11 days, he said. "Then you know considerably more than we do at present. I think a direct conversation would serve us both." "I thought you might say that," Korath said. "I am beaming over. Alone." It was not a request. Worf turned to look at Picard with an expression that said, clearly and without words, that he had tactical objections that he was choosing to express through facial communication rather than chain of command. Picard gave him a slight nod that said, equally clearly, that the objections were noted and the decision stood. "We'll meet you in Transporter Room 2, Picard said. Korath arrived with a data chip in her hand and the contained energy of someone who had been sitting with urgent information for longer than was comfortable. She declined tea. She declined a chair. She stood in the observation lounge with Picard, Riker, Troy, Data, and Worf arranged around her, and she placed the data chip on the table and said, without preamble, 11 days ago, we were conducting a routine patrol of the Expanse boundary when our long-range sensors detected the Federation vessel's resonance broadcast. The frequency was unusual enough that our science officer flagged it immediately. We moved to investigate. She paused. We arrived at the Federation vessel's location 4 hours after you did. We found it drifting exactly as you found it. We did not board it. We scanned it and identified the life signs and determined the crew was incapacitated but alive. We also detected what your sensors had presumably already detected by that point. The giants, Troy said. Korath looked at her. Is that what you are calling them? It seemed appropriate, Troy said quietly. Perhaps. Korath's jaw tightened slightly. We observed for 2 days. Our science officer, who is exceptional, I will say that without reservation, developed a preliminary theoretical framework that I believe is consistent with what your own scientists have likely concluded, that what we are seeing is not the complete entity, that what we are seeing is a manifestation in our spatial dimensions of something that exists more fully elsewhere. Our chief engineer and operations officer reached the same conclusion approximately 3 hours ago, Data confirmed. Something flickered in Korath's eyes. Brief, quickly controlled. Then we are at the same position, she said. We know what it is not. We know that our conventional instruments give us an incomplete picture. We know that the 2 crew members of the Federation vessel were not killed. Their biosignatures did not end. They were displaced. She looked around the table. On the 3rd day of our observation, my first officer, Commander Torak, requested permission to attempt a closer scan. He believed that a lower power, or higher frequency active scan directed at a specific angle relative to the entity's movement might allow us to construct a more complete cross-sectional map. She paused. I granted permission. The observation lounge was very quiet. What happened? Riker asked. Torak and the 2 officers who accompanied him to the scanning station are currently in our medical bay, Korath said. They are alive. They are in the same neurological state as your Federation crew members on the Meridian. Their minds are active and unreachable. She looked at the data chip on the table. But before they lost responsiveness, Torak managed to transmit the scan results. What he found is on that chip. She paused, and this pause was different from the others. Shorter, harder, one with something behind it that Picard recognized as the pause of someone about to say something they have been carrying for days and have not yet been able to put down. It also contains our sensor logs from what happened on day 7. Day 7, Picard said. We encountered a second one, Korath said, moving from a different direction. The 2 passed through the same region of space simultaneously. We do not know if they were aware of each other. We do not know if awareness is a concept that applies. But when they occupied the same coordinates, our sensors registered something that our science officer, before she lost consciousness, described as a harmonic. She looked at Data. She used the word resonance. And she said it was like 2 notes producing a 3rd frequency that neither of them contained individually. Data was very still for exactly the kind of moment that indicated he was processing something significant. A harmonic produced by 2 higher dimensional entities intersecting in 3-dimensional space, he said slowly. The cross-sections of their forms interacting to produce a combined frequency that neither would generate independently. He paused. That frequency, would it be in a subspace band? Our instruments identified it in a subspace band. Yes, Korath said. A band our sensors had not previously documented. The table was silent for a moment, while everyone in the room processed the implication at their own speed. Picard reached it first, followed almost simultaneously by Riker, who sat forward with the expression of someone who had just watched two separate pieces of evidence snap together into a shape he wished they hadn't formed. The Meridian's frequency, Riker said, the one they were broadcasting, the one that started all of this, was not a randomly discovered anomalous signal, Picard said. It was a naturally occurring frequency, one that these entities produce themselves. When two of them intersect, Data said, the Meridian's resonance survey was designed to catalog natural subspace frequency variations in this region. They were not generating a novel signal. He paused. They were recording an echo, a frequency that had already been produced by the entities themselves at some prior point. And when they broadcast it back into subspace, they rang the bell, Riker said quietly. They broadcast a frequency that the entities themselves produce, Data said, which may be, in some functional sense, a signal, a communication, a marker of presence. He looked at Picard. The Meridian did not attract these entities randomly. They announced their presence in a language that these entities were already using, and the entities responded. The observation lounge absorbed this. Korath looked around the table with the expression of someone who had carried this conclusion alone for 3 days and found it marginally less heavy now that others were carrying it alongside her. There is something else, she said. She reached for the data chip and turned it in her fingers without activating it. On day 9, after Torak and the others had been incapacitated, when or after we had confirmed that there were 2 of them moving in this region, she paused, we detected a third. The silence that followed had a different quality from the previous silences. It was denser, more considered, the kind of silence that a room full of intelligent people produced when they had collectively arrived at the understanding that the situation was larger than the frame they had been using to contain it. A third, Picard said. Moving from the rimward direction, Korath said. Slower than the other 2, or what our sensors interpreted as slower. I want to be precise, as your android has been precise, about the limitations of our instruments. What we observed was a cross-section that changed position more gradually than the other 2 cross-sections. She set the data chip down. 3 of them, Picard, or in this region of space. And we do not know how long they have been here, because we only began looking 11 days ago. Picard looked at the data chip. Then he looked at Korath. I want your full sensor archive, he said. 11 days of observation. That is significantly more than we have. Combined with our own findings, it may be enough to begin constructing a theoretical framework that goes beyond what they are not. That is why I am here, Korath said simply. And your crew, Troy said. She had been quiet for most of the briefing, listening with the attention of someone taking in not just the content, but the emotional texture of everything being communicated. She was looking at Korath now with an expression of genuine, careful concern. Your incapacitated crew members? How are they? Korath looked at Troy for a moment with the particular expression of a Klingon warrior encountering sincere empathy from an unexpected direction and not quite knowing the appropriate response to it. They are alive, she said. They're experiencing something, Troy said. Something that occupies all of their cognitive resources. Something that their minds are completely absorbed by. She paused. I've been trying to reach the Meridian crew empathically, getting close enough to sense the quality of their experience without getting drawn into it. She looked at Picard. Captain, it isn't distressing. That's what I keep finding. And I want to be careful how I communicate this because I'm not suggesting it's benign. But whatever they're experiencing, it isn't pain. It isn't terror. She paused. It's closer to awe. The kind of awe that fills every available space in a mind and leaves room for nothing else. The observation lounge was very quiet. They are seeing something, Data said. Yes, Troy said. Something that requires everything a mind has in order to perceive even a fraction of it. She looked at her hands for a moment. I think the 2 missing crew members from the Meridian saw more of it. I think their minds reach further. She looked up. I don't know if that's better or worse. Outside the Enterprise in the dark of the Shackleton Expanse, 3 cross-sections of something that had no complete form in 3-dimensional space moved along paths that Federation navigation systems had no geometry to describe. They moved without urgency and without communication, and without any detectable awareness of the vessel that sat watching them with raised shields and armed weapons, and a crew of brilliant, determined people who were only just beginning to understand that the tools they had brought to this encounter were not equal to the problem. In the Klingon bird of prey, 200 kilometers off the Enterprise's port bow, 3 warriors lay in their medical bay, with their eyes open and their minds entirely elsewhere, experiencing something that had no name in any language that either ship carried. And in the deep dark of the expanse, from a direction that neither ship's sensors had yet oriented toward, there was the first marginal, almost imperceptible suggestion, a slight wrongness in the star field, a barely detectable occlusion at the very edge of long-range sensor resolution that indicated a fourth cross-section had just become observable. Deanna Troi had been a Starfleet counselor for 11 years, and in that time she had developed a professional relationship with the limits of her empathic ability that was, by necessity, honest and precise. She knew what she could do and what she could not do, knew the difference between genuine perception and interpretive projection, knew when she was reading an emotional signature with clarity and when she was constructing a narrative from ambiguous sensation. She had learned through years of practice and occasional painful error to hold her perceptions with appropriate epistemic humility, to say "I sense" rather than "I know," to qualify, or to acknowledge the instrument's limitations alongside its readings. She had never in 11 years encountered anything that made her question the instrument itself. It began at 19:23 hours, approximately 4 hours after Korath's briefing, while Troi was in her office working through her notes on the Meridian crew's neurological state. She had been attempting to construct a framework for carefully, safely reaching toward the empathic presence she had been sensing since their arrival. A controlled, methodical approach that would allow her to gather information without exposing herself to whatever had consumed the cognitive resources of 41 Starfleet personnel and 3 Klingon warriors. She had protocols for this kind of work. She had academic training in empathic hazard assessment from her time at the Betazoid Institute. She was not approaching this carelessly. She was not approaching it at all in the end. It came to her, not aggressively, not suddenly. It was not the empathic equivalent of a blow or an intrusion. It was slower than that, and in some ways more unsettling for its slowness. The way that a room getting gradually colder was more unsettling than a sudden temperature drop, because the gradual version gave you time to notice and time to wonder how long it had already been happening before you noticed. Troi became aware of it the way you became aware of a sound you could not quite hear, not through direct perception, but through the effect it was having on the surrounding perceptual field. The emotional signatures of the ship's crew, which she maintained as a constant background awareness, the way a navigator maintained a constant background awareness of the ship's heading, began to shift. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have registered on any instrument or been visible to any observer. The specific emotional textures of individual crew members, Lieutenant Worf's characteristic coiled alertness, Geordi's focused analytical engagement, Dr. Crusher's careful clinical concentration, were still present and recognizable. But they were present the way objects were present in a room where the lighting had changed. The same shapes, a different quality of shadow. She put down her PADD and sat very still and paid attention. The presence that she had been describing to Picard as something that receded when she reached toward it was not receding now. It was not advancing either. It was not doing anything that mapped onto a spatial metaphor in any comfortable way. It was simply more present than it had been. As though a frequency that had been operating below the threshold of clear perception had been, for reasons she did not understand, incrementally adjusted upward. She could not localize it. She could not assign it a direction or a distance. It existed in the empathic sense the way a temperature existed in a room, pervasive, ambient, coming from everywhere and therefore from nowhere in particular. And it was vast. That was the word that kept presenting itself, and she kept testing it against her perception to see if it was accurate, and it kept being accurate and also kept being radically insufficient. Vast the way the ocean was vast, if you had only ever seen water in a glass. Vast the way a sky was vast, if you had spent your entire life in a room with a low ceiling. Not bigger than the things she had experienced before. Beyond comparison with the things she had experienced before, in the way that a number with too many digits eventually ceased to be a number and became a concept. She was writing in her professional notepad, the physical one, not the PADD, because her hands needed something to do, and the act of writing by hand was grounding in a way that typing was not. When she became aware that the quality of the presence had changed, not intensified, not diminished, changed. The way a piece of music changed when a new instrument entered. The volume was the same, but the texture was different. The harmonic content was different. Something that had not been present before was now woven into what was. She wrote 0931 hours, change in empathic signature, quality shift, not single source, multiple. She stared at what she had written. Then she crossed out multiple and wrote many, and then crossed that out too and wrote not countable by available methods and put her pen down. She tapped her comm badge. Troy to Picard. Picard here. Go ahead, counselor. Captain, I need to see you, and Data, and I need Dr. Crusher present as well. She paused, looking at her notepad, at the inadequate words. I've been receiving something that I think is important, and I want to document it carefully before I try to interpret it, because I'm not certain my interpretive frameworks are adequate, and I want to be honest about that before I present conclusions. A brief pause on the other end. Conference room. Asha, 10 minutes. She spent the 10 minutes writing everything she could write, every specific quality of perception she could identify and articulate, bracketed throughout with careful notations of uncertainty, organized not by conclusion, but by raw observational content. By the time she walked into the conference room, she had 4 pages of notes and a clarity about what she was going to say that was accompanied by a complete absence of clarity about what it meant. Picard, Riker, Data, and Crusher were already there. Korth had requested, through Worf, to be included in any further briefings, and she sat at the far end of the table with her data chip and her contained, watchful gravity. Worf stood near the door with his arms folded in the posture that meant he had assessed the situation as one requiring physical readiness and was maintaining that readiness out of principle. Troy sat down, placed her notepad on the table, and looked at them. I want to start with what I know with the highest confidence, she said, and work toward what I'm less certain of in the same way that Data structured his earlier analysis. I think that's the right methodology for this. Agreed, Picard said. What I know with the highest confidence, the empathic presence I have been sensing since our arrival has changed in the past hour. It has become more perceptible, not because it has moved closer in any spatial sense, but because something about the conditions of perception has shifted. I don't know what those conditions are or what changed them. She looked at her notes. What I know with slightly less confidence, but still with significant certainty, the presence is not singular. This is new. Earlier, I could not determine multiplicity or singularity. The quality of the empathic signature was too diffuse. In the past hour, the signature has developed a harmonic complexity that is consistent with multiple sources rather than one. Consistent with there being more than one entity, Data said. Yes, possibly many more than one. She paused. And what I know with less certainty but still believe is worth reporting. The quality of what I'm receiving has changed in a way that I want to describe very carefully because the description matters and I don't want to overinterpret it. She looked at her notepad. To me earlier, I described the presence as something that felt like the space where an emotion should be. Something the empathic sense reached toward and found nothing recognizable. That description was accurate at the time. She looked up. It is no longer accurate. The conference room was very still. What has changed? Picard asked. There is something there now, Troy said. When I reach toward it, and I want to be clear that I am doing this carefully and with full awareness of the risk, I am not reaching far or deep. When I reach toward it, there is something that responds. Not in the way that an emotional signature responds, not in the way that a mind responds when you make empathic contact with it, in a different way, in a way that I don't have a precise vocabulary for. She paused. The closest analogy I can construct is the difference between looking at a window and looking through a window. Earlier, there was a window. Now there is something on the other side of it, and it has oriented toward us. The silence that followed was the kind that rooms produced when everyone in them was processing the same implication, and no one wanted to be the first to say it aloud. Riker said it. They know we're here. I think they have always known we were here, Troy said carefully. I think what has changed is not their awareness of our presence, but something about their relationship to it, their orientation toward it. She folded her hands on the table. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters enormously. What I am receiving is not attention in the way that a predator attends to prey, or the way that a curious mind attends to something interesting. She paused for a long time, long enough that Picard let the pause develop rather than filling it, because he could see that she was working on language for something that language had not been built to carry. It's the way that a very large body of water attends to a very small stone that has just been dropped into it, she said finally. The water doesn't care about the stone. The water doesn't feel anything about the stone. But the stone has created a disturbance, and the water is responding to the disturbance according to its own nature. And the response is happening whether the water is aware of the stone specifically or not. Korath had been listening with the absolute focused stillness of a warrior in a situation where movement was not the appropriate response. She spoke now for the first time since the briefing began. The resonance frequency, she said, the one the Federation vessel was broadcasting, the one that these entities produce themselves when they intersect. She looked at Troy. You said the Meridian rang a bell, but if the entities themselves produce this frequency, then they have been ringing that bell for as long as they have existed, and we have been surrounded by the sound of it in subspace for perhaps the entire history of our spacefaring civilization. She let that land on the table and sat back. We never listened in the right frequency band, Geordi said from the doorway. He had arrived 2 minutes into the briefing, quietly, and positioned himself near the entrance with his visor oriented toward the group and his expression carrying the quality of a man whose earlier theoretical conversation with Data had been reaching toward exactly this conclusion. Our subspace monitoring has always been oriented toward warp-capable frequencies, communication bands, known anomaly signatures. We built our instruments to hear what we expected to hear. And we never expected to hear this, Riker said. We never imagined there was anything to hear, Picard said quietly. He was looking at the center of the table with the expression of a man rearranging a very large number of things simultaneously, which raises the question of how long they have been here. Not in this region, in our galaxy, in our space. Based on the 11 days of Klingon sensor data combined with our own observations, Data said, and applying the higher dimensional cross-section model that Lieutenant Commander LaForge and I developed earlier, I can attempt a rough calculation of their movement trajectories and extrapolate backward to estimate how long they have been in this region of the expanse. He paused. However, I want to note that this calculation is subject to significant uncertainty because I am extrapolating three-dimensional path data for entities that do not primarily exist in 3 dimensions. The path we observe may not be the path they are actually traveling. Give me the estimate anyway, Picard said. Based on observable cross-section trajectory data for the 3 confirmed entities, Data said, my best estimate is that they have been present in this region of the Shackleton Expanse for between 40 and 60 years. He paused. There is a wide confidence interval on that estimate. The lower bound is 15 years. The upper bound, another pause. The upper bound is not well constrained by the available data. Meaning they may have been here much longer, Riker said. Meaning the available data does not allow me to exclude the possibility that they have been here for a very long time indeed, Data said, with the careful precision of a man choosing not to say the specific number his calculations were producing, because the specific number was not one he was ready to defend. Our Troy had been sitting with her hands folded and her attention partially elsewhere. The careful, practiced split focus of an empath monitoring a background signal while conducting a foreground conversation. She spoke now with a quality of measured urgency that caused everyone in the room to look at her. Captain, she said, something is changing. Picard looked at her directly. Tell me. The orientation I described, she said, the way the presence has been attending to us, the stone in the water, the disturbance being felt without specific awareness of its source. She paused. The quality of that attention is shifting. Something in it has become more specific, more directed. She looked at him steadily. I think they've found the stone. The conference room was very, very quiet. Data, Picard said without looking away from Troy, which were sensors. Data moved to the wall panel and pulled up the live sensor display in 3 swift movements. He looked at it. He looked at it for exactly the kind of moment that meant the data was unambiguous, and he was deciding how to present it rather than how to interpret it. The three entities whose cross-sections we have been tracking, he said, have altered their trajectories. All three simultaneously. They are now moving on paths that will bring their cross-sections to within. He paused. Within direct sensor range of this vessel, based on current trajectories, the first cross-section will be within 50 kilometers of the Enterprise in approximately 4 hours. And the fourth entity, Worf said from the door, the one detected at long range. Also moving toward our position, Data said, at a rate that suggests it will arrive at approximately the same time as the others. The conference room processed this. Picard stood, straightening his jacket with the small, precise gesture that meant a decision had crystallized. He looked around the table, at Riker's controlled urgency, at Crusher's careful clinical focus, at Data's steady readiness, at Korath's warrior gravity, at Troy's divided attention, at Worf's coiled professional purpose. Then we have 4 hours, Wayne, he said, and I intend to use every minute of them. He looked at Data. I want to know everything that 47 failed analytical approaches in 11 days of Klingon sensor data and Counselor Troy's empathic observations can tell us about how to communicate with something that perceives us the way the ocean perceives a stone. He looked at Troy. Good, because if they are orienting toward us specifically, then something about our presence has become meaningful to them. And if something about us is meaningful to them, then communication is not impossible. He paused. It may simply require that we find the right language. And if communication is not possible, Korath asked with the directness of a warrior who valued honest assessment over comfortable framing. Picard looked at her steadily. Then we will face that when we know it to be true, he said. Not before. Outside in the dark, 4 cross-sections of something incomprehensibly large turned with the patient, unhurried certainty of things that had never needed to hurry, and began to move toward the small vessel that had, for reasons that may have been as simple as frequency and as complex as the nature of consciousness itself, each become the first thing in a very long time that had made a sound they recognized. Q appeared at 21:56 hours, sitting in the captain's chair. He was not there, and then he was there, with the absolute absence of transition that was his particular trademark. No shimmer, no sound, no displacement of air, simply the sudden presence of an immaculately dressed humanoid occupying the center of the Enterprise's bridge with the comfortable proprietary ease of someone who had decided the furniture was his. He was wearing, for reasons that were presumably amusing to him, a Starfleet admiral's uniform, complete with the 4 pips and the gold trim, and the particular expression of benevolent authority that Picard had learned over years of deeply reluctant experience. Ekush was the expression Q wore when he was most profoundly unsettled and least willing to show it. He looked at the view screen, where the sensor overlay now showed 4 slowly converging cross-sectional outlines moving through the dark of the expanse toward the Enterprise's position. He looked at it for a long moment without saying anything, which was itself alarming because Q's relationship with silence was the relationship of a man who considered it a personal affront. Q, Picard said, from the upper bridge where he had been standing with Data reviewing the latest sensor projections when the apparition appeared. His voice was level and tired in equal measure. I confess that your timing is, for once, not entirely unwelcome. Jean-Luc, Q said. He did not turn around. He continued looking at the view screen with the expression of someone viewing a painting they had hoped never to see again. You have gotten yourself into something quite extraordinary this time. We are aware of that, Picard said. He descended to the command level and stood beside his own chair, looking at Q with the measured, careful attention he always gave to Q, taking in not just the words but the performance, the choices behind the performance, the information that the performance was designed to conceal. What I would find considerably more useful than an assessment of the situation is your understanding of it. Q turned to look at him then, and there it was. The thing that the Admiral's uniform and the practiced insouciance and the deliberate occupation of someone else's chair were meant to conceal. It was not fear, or because Q was not a being that experienced fear in any way that mapped onto the humanoid version of the emotion. It was something more fundamental than fear. It was the look of an entity that had operated for its entire existence with the comfortable certainty of being among the most significant things in the universe, and had recently been reminded, with considerable force, that the universe was under no obligation to organize itself around that certainty. I will tell you what I know, Q said, which was in itself so unprecedented that Worf's hand moved involuntarily toward his weapons console before professional discipline stopped it. Q telling things, genuinely telling things, without games or conditions or Baroque theatrical indirection, was not behavior that anyone on the bridge had a precedent for. And I will tell you what I know, because what you are doing, sitting here with your shields raised and your weapons armed and your magnificent android running his magnificent analyses, is the equivalent of a mayfly examining the sun and concluding that it can be adequately described by its effect on the mayfly's wings. Then help us do better, Picard said. Q stood from the captain's chair, a small gesture, but a meaningful one. He did not usually vacate things he had occupied. He moved to the view screen and stood before it, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the four converging outlines with the expression of a man reviewing a document he had hoped to never be called upon to discuss. The continuum, Q said, has a word for them. It is not a word in any language that exists in the corporeal universe. And I cannot translate it into any symbol system your universal translator would recognize. So I will describe what the word means instead. He paused. The word means that which was here before the question of what was here could be asked. The bridge was very quiet. The hum of the ship's systems continued its steady, reassuring, insufficient sound. They predate the continuum, Data said. It was not precisely a question. They predate everything you have a concept for, Q said, without turning from the view screen. The continuum has existed since before your universe's current expansion cycle began. We watched your Big Bang, Jean-Luc, with the detached interest of beings who had already seen several. We consider ourselves rather senior residents of this cosmos. He paused. They were here before us. They were here before the conditions that produced us. They were here before the physics that governs your universe had settled into its current configuration. Another pause, longer. We do not know how long they have been here. We do not know what they were doing before the universe gave them anything to move through. We are not certain the question is meaningful. Picard absorbed this with the focused, disciplined attention of a man who had learned that Q's revelations, filtered through theatricality and condescension, always contained precise and specific truth that rewarded careful processing. And in all that time, and he said carefully, the continuum has not communicated with them. We have tried, Q said, and the two words carried a weight that was completely unlike Q's usual register. Not performed weight, not theatrical gravity, but the specific density of genuine admission. 3 times in the history of the continuum, 3 distinct attempts using the full capabilities of beings who can rewrite the laws of physics with casual intention. He turned from the view screen and looked at Picard with an expression that Picard had never seen on Q's face before. An expression that was, beneath all its complexity, simply honest. The first attempt produced no response. The second attempt produced no response. The third attempt? He stopped. What happened on the third attempt? Riker asked from his station to Picard's right. 11 members of the continuum, Q said, directed their full combined attention toward one of these entities and attempted direct cognitive contact. He looked at Riker. Those 11 members of the continuum are still in contact. Why did they have been for what you would calculate as approximately 3 million years? They have not communicated with the rest of the continuum since the moment of contact. We do not know if they are experiencing what your catatonic crew members appear to be experiencing. Something vast, something overwhelming, something that requires every cognitive resource available to perceive even a fragment of. He paused. Or if they are experiencing something else entirely. We simply do not know. And the continuum does not know, and the continuum is not accustomed to not knowing things. The bridge processed this in the way that bridge crews processed things that were too large for immediate integration, by continuing to function, by maintaining the professional motions of their duties, by allowing the information to settle into understanding at whatever pace the psyche could manage without fracturing. Why are you telling us this? Picard asked. The continuum has never offered this kind of information without a price or a purpose. Q looked at him for a long moment. Because you are about to make contact with them, he said, and I want to watch. And before you make the obvious objection, yes, I am aware that my wanting to watch is not, from your perspective, a satisfying justification. So I will add, Because what you are attempting is something the Continuum concluded was impossible and stopped attempting 3 million years ago. And because you are attempting it with considerably fewer resources than we brought to bear, and because he paused and something that was almost warmth crossed his face. Because you are, against every reasonable expectation, occasionally capable of things that beings considerably more powerful than you have concluded cannot be done. And I find that I am not ready to stop watching you try. It was, Picard thought, the most honest thing Q had ever said. Can you tell us anything about the nature of the contact? Data asked. Anything that would inform our approach. The frequency of the Meridian's broadcast was a naturally occurring signal that these entities produce themselves. Does the Continuum know the significance of that frequency? Whether it constitutes language or something more fundamental? Q looked at Data with an expression that contained genuine respect. Brief, quickly modulated into something more performative, but there. What the Continuum's assessment is that what you are calling a frequency is not language in any sense that implies structured information exchange. He said, it is something more fundamental. The closest analogy in your conceptual framework would be existence itself, expressing itself. Not a signal that means something, a signal that simply is something. The difference between a word and a heartbeat. He paused. Your Meridian crew did not send a message. They expressed an existence. An existence, genuine, present, alive existence, is the one thing these entities respond to. Because they can perceive it, Troy said quietly. She had arrived on the bridge during Q's appearance and stood near the turbolift doors, her expression carrying the quality of someone who has just had a private and uncertain perception confirmed by external evidence. What I've been sensing, the orientation, the attention shifting toward us specifically, it's not because we made a sound they recognized. It's because we are alive, because we exist in a particular way. Consciousness, Q said, specifically mortal consciousness, the kind that exists in a moment rather than across all moments simultaneously, the kind that has a beginning and will have an end. He looked at Troy. The Betazoid is correct. Your presence, the specific quality of your presence, brief and burning and absolutely convinced of its own significance, is what has drawn their attention. He looked at Picard. The question that the Continuum could not answer in 3 attempts using the full force of omnipotent cognition is whether that attention can become a conversation. Because everything the Continuum brought to those 3 attempts was, from these entities' perspective, something like them. Old, vast, not mortal. He gestured briefly at the view screen. You are something they have not encountered before. Or if they have encountered it, not in this way. Not with this. He seemed genuinely to struggle for the word, which was the most unsettling thing Picard had witnessed in the entire encounter. Not with this intentionality. You are small and you are brief, and you are going to try to talk to something that existed before the concept of talking, and you are going to try it on purpose, with full awareness of what you are attempting. He paused. The Continuum found that remarkable. I find it remarkable. I am not prepared to say it is sufficient. But I am prepared to say it is interesting. How long do we have? Riker asked. Before their cross-sections reach your position? Q looked at the view screen. Approximately 90 minutes at current trajectories. He paused. Though trajectory implies they are moving through space to reach you, which is not precisely what is happening. They are not moving toward you. They are orienting toward you through the dimension in which they primarily exist, and the cross-sections you observe are moving as a consequence of that orientation. He looked at Picard. The distinction matters because it means that shields and weapons and warp engines are even less relevant than you have already concluded. Then what is relevant? Picard asked. Q was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a being choosing simplicity over performance because the moment required it. In every attempt the Continuum made, he said, we came with the intention of understanding them, of reducing them to something the Continuum could know and categorize and file appropriately. He paused. I am not telling you what to do instead. I am telling you that intention is something they can perceive, because they can perceive everything about the quality of your existence, Jean-Luc. Not your words, not your technology, your intention. He sat down. Not in the captain's chair this time, but in Troy's chair, which was its own kind of statement. He looked at the view screen with the expression of someone who has said everything they came to say and is now prepared to watch. Picard looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to face the view screen, to face the four slowly converging outlines of things that had existed before. Existence had a name, and he thought about intention and about what it meant to approach something incomprehensible, not with the goal of comprehending it, but with something else. Something the Continuum had not brought to its 3 attempts. Something that was perhaps the specific property of beings who were small and brief and burning and absolutely, stubbornly present in their moment. Data, he said quietly. I want everything we know about that resonance frequency, and I want to know if we can generate it ourselves. He paused. Not to broadcast it, not to signal, just to express it. The way a heartbeat expresses itself. Because if what they perceive is not message but existence, then the question is not what we say to them. He paused. The question is what we are, when they arrive. Behind him, Q said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Outside, in the deep and ancient dark, 4 vast and incomprehensible things drew closer through dimensions that had no names in any language, that had ever been spoken by anyone who had ever been young enough to be capable of the particular, desperate, gorgeous courage of trying anyway. The next 90 minutes were the most productive and the most inadequate that the Enterprise had ever generated simultaneously. Data worked at a pace that, even by his standards, was extraordinary. His positronic brain operating at processing loads that the ship's internal diagnostic systems flagged 3 times with automated efficiency warnings that he dismissed without breaking the rhythm of his analysis. He had restructured his entire analytical framework in the 40 minutes since Q's briefing, discarding the physics-oriented approach that had produced 47 failures and replacing it with something that had no formal name in Federation science, because Federation science had never needed a name for it. He was not trying to measure the giants anymore. He was trying to understand what it meant to exist in their presence, and to find, within that understanding, something that could be expressed rather than transmitted. The distinction, as Q had framed it, was between a word and a heartbeat. Data understood words with extraordinary precision. He had studied linguistics, semiotics, communication theory across 450 distinct Federation and non-Federation languages, had written papers on the structural properties of information exchange that were cited in Starfleet Academy curricula. Words were his native environment, but heartbeats, the involuntary, continuous, biological expression of a living system simply being alive, were something he had spent considerable portions of his existence contemplating from the outside. He found to his considerable surprise that this was an advantage. When the resonance frequency the Meridian was broadcasting, he said to Geordi, who had been working beside him at the secondary science station for the past hour with the focused, sleepless energy of an engineer who had found a problem worth solving, is not, as I initially analyzed it, a single discrete frequency. It is a harmonic series. The base frequency is what the Meridian recorded and broadcast. But that base frequency is the fundamental tone of a much larger structure, a series of overtones extending into subspace bands that our instruments were not, until this evening, calibrated to detect. Geordi looked at the display Data was showing him. His visor processed the harmonic series as a visual representation, or the overlapping wave patterns rendered in the false color mapping that his neural interface translated into something his brain could interpret as sight. He was quiet for a moment, tracing the pattern with his eyes. It's biological, he said. It is consistent with biological processes, Data said. Specifically, it is consistent with the electromagnetic and subspace signature produced by the electrical activity of a sufficiently complex nervous system. A brain generating consciousness produces a characteristic subspace signature, a fact that Federation neuroscience has documented but never considered significant, because the signature is extremely weak at the scale of individual organisms and dissipates rapidly in normal space. He paused. In subspace, the signature propagates differently. In the specific subspace bands associated with this harmonic series, it propagates considerably further than we had previously estimated. Geordi stared at him. Are you saying that thinking produces a subspace signal? I am saying that the electrical activity of a conscious mind produces a harmonic series in subspace that, when propagated through the specific bands these entities appear to inhabit or traverse, constitutes something detectable. Data looked at the display. The Meridian was not broadcasting an alien signal. The Meridian's resonance survey equipment accidentally amplified and broadcast the subspace harmonic signature of its own crew's collective neurological activity. He paused. 43 conscious minds, amplified by a resonance emitter operating in the correct frequency band, produced a signal strong enough to be detectable at considerable range. He paused again. The Enterprise has a crew of over 1,000. Geordi was very still for a moment. We've been generating this signal the whole time, he said. Every ship, every station, every inhabited planet. We've been generating this signal constantly, just too quietly, too locally, for it to reach anything. Until the Meridian accidentally provided amplification, Data said. Yes. And these entities, Geordi said slowly, have been moving through a galaxy full of conscious beings for however long they've been here, and they've been perceiving us, at the edge of their perception, the way you might hear a very faint sound from a very great distance and not be certain it was a sound at all. He looked at the harmonic display. And then someone rang a bell. And they turned to look, Data said, or the equivalent of looking, for a being whose sensory apparatus operates on principles we have not yet fully characterized. He looked at Geordi. The question I have been working on for the past hour is whether we can generate this signal deliberately at sufficient amplitude, with sufficient intentionality, to use Q's term, to constitute something more than a passive neurological emission. You want to think at them, Geordi said. I want to express existence at them, Data said, with the careful precision of a being who had just made a distinction that was enormously important to him. Thinking implies content, implies information, implies the word rather than the heartbeat. What I am attempting to determine is whether we can express the quality of conscious existence itself, the specific signature of minds that are present, aware, finite, and choosing, at a level that constitutes something meaningful to an entity that Q tells us perceives exactly that quality. And the shields, Geordi asked? Worf is not going to love this conversation. Shields would interfere with both our ability to project the signal and, potentially, with the entity's ability to perceive it, Data said. The deflector dish could serve as an amplifier, but only if it is not simultaneously maintaining the shield grid. He paused. I am also cognizant of the fact that lowering shields in the presence of 4 entities of unknown intent and incalculable power is a recommendation that requires considerably more justification than the theoretical framework I have just described. Leave that part to the captain, Geordi said. Let's make sure the technical case is airtight first. They worked. Around them, the ship continued its watch, its crew moving with a particular combination of professional focus and barely suppressed existential awareness that characterized people doing their jobs at the edge of something they could not fully comprehend. In sickbay, Beverly Crusher had not slept and was not considering sleeping. She was running her 14th consecutive diagnostic series on the Meridian crew and had begun, punished with the careful deliberateness of a physician who knew she was working at the boundary of her training, to develop a new framework for what she was seeing. The neurological activity in the catatonic crew members was not random. She had established this 2 hours ago, and it had been nagging at her ever since, with the specific quality of a finding that was important in a way she had not yet determined how to articulate. Their brainwave patterns were complex and active, and completely unlike any mapped neurological state in the Federation medical database. But they were not chaotic. There was structure to them, pattern. The kind of pattern that, in any neurological state she recognized, indicated purposeful cognitive activity rather than passive reception. Indicated minds that were not simply being overwhelmed by input, but were actively, effortfully engaging with it. They were not receiving, she realized. They were participating. She pulled up the comparative analysis she had been running between the Meridian crew's neurological signatures and the base harmonic frequency that Data had identified, and she looked at it with fresh eyes and the specific cold clarity of a physician who had just understood something she wished she hadn't. Computer, she said, compare the neurological harmonic signature of the Meridian crew's current brain activity with the resonance frequency series identified in Commander Data's subspace analysis from the past hour. Overlay and identify correlation. The computer took 4 seconds, which was longer than usual, which meant the analysis was complex. When the result appeared on her display, she looked at it for a long time without moving. The correlation was 94.7%. The Meridian crew's brains were generating the harmonic series, all 41 of them, simultaneously in perfect synchronization, at an amplitude that dwarfed anything a normal human nervous system produced. Their neurological activity had been entrained, synchronized to the frequency of the giants, the way a tuning fork synchronized to a struck note in its vicinity. They had not been incapacitated. They had been incorporated. Their minds had been brought into resonance with something vast, and the resonance was consuming every available cognitive resource, not because it was overwhelming them, but because they were, voluntarily, if that word applied to a process they had had no warning of and no choice about, participating in something that required everything they had. She tapped her comm badge. Nyara Crusher to Picard. Captain, I need you in sickbay. Now, please. Picard arrived in sickbay with Troy and found Crusher standing between two biobeds, her expression carrying the specific quality of a physician delivering a diagnosis she had not expected and was still integrating herself. They're not catatonic, Crusher said without preamble, because there was no longer time for preamble. Their minds are completely active and completely engaged. They're in resonance with the giants. Their neurological harmonic signature has been synchronized to the entity's base frequency, and they're generating that frequency themselves at amplitudes their nervous systems shouldn't be capable of producing. She showed him the correlation data. Whatever the giants are experiencing, perceiving, being, these 41 people are participating in it, are at the edge of it, at the tiniest peripheral margin of it, the way you might dip your hand into an ocean and technically be part of the ocean. She paused. But they're in it, consciously, actively, with their minds running at full capacity in a direction we can't observe from the outside. Troy had gone very still. I can feel them, she said quietly. I couldn't before. Their signal was indistinguishable from the background presence of the giants. But now that I know what to reach for, she paused, her eyes closing briefly with the concentration of someone listening to something at the edge of audibility. They're not distressed. They're not afraid. They are... She paused for a long time. There isn't a word. There is no word for what they are experiencing. The closest I can come is that they are encountering the fact that they exist, from the outside, for the first time. The way you might see your own face for the first time and understand suddenly that you have one. Picard looked at the biobeds. At the young ensign he had noticed earlier, sitting with his knees drawn up and his hands open, his eyes tracking movement without responding to it. He looked at the 41 people who had dipped their hands into an ocean and were still, hours later, too absorbed by what the water felt like to remember how to speak. Can they come back? He asked. Crusher hesitated in the way that she hesitated when the honest answer was one she was not ready to be certain of. I don't know, she said. Their neurological state is stable. The resonance isn't damaging them. There's no evidence of any kind of neurological injury. But the entrainment is very deep, and the amplitude at which they're generating the frequency is... She paused. It's increasing, slowly but measurably. As the giants get closer, the resonance gets stronger. As though proximity increases the entrainment, Picard said. Yes, Crusher said, which means that when the giants arrive at our position, the entrainment will be significantly stronger, Picard said. For the Meridian crew, Crusher said, possibly for others. She looked at Troy. Troy opened her eyes. I'm aware, she said calmly. I've been managing my exposure carefully. But yes, I can feel the pull. The invitation, if that's the right word. The resonance wants to include. That's the quality of it. It's not aggressive. It's the opposite of aggressive. It's an opening. Picard was quiet for a moment, standing in sickbay with 41 people who were participating in something incomprehensible, listening to his ship hum around him and feeling the weight of the next 30 minutes settling into his understanding of what he was being called upon to do. Data, he said, tapping his comm badge. What is the status of the deflector dish modification? Theoretically sound and technically implementable in approximately 22 minutes. Data's voice replied immediately, in the manner of someone who had been expecting exactly this question. However, Captain, I want to flag one additional finding that I believe is relevant to your decision-making. Go ahead. The neurological harmonic signature that the Meridian crew is now generating at elevated amplitude, Data said, is detectable on our sensors. It is, in fact, contributing to the signal that the giants appear to be orienting toward. The 41 crew members are, in effect, acting as an amplifier, bringing the Enterprise's total neurological output to a level that is, by my calculations, the highest concentration of conscious neurological activity that these entities have been in proximity to in this region of space in the period covered by our combined sensor data. A pause. We are, Captain, already the loudest heartbeat in the room. What the deflector modification would allow us to do is ensure that the heartbeat is intentional, directed, chosen rather than simply emitted. Picard stood in sick bay and looked at 41 minds participating in something vast, and looked at his counselor managing the edge of an opening, and thought about Q's word, intention, and about what it meant to be small and brief and burning, and to choose, with full awareness, to express that burning towards something that had existed before the concept of fire. 22 minutes, he said. Begin the modification, Mr. Data. Outside, the four cross-sections continued their convergence, patient and immense and utterly indifferent to speed, because speed had never been a concept that applied to anything they needed to do. In the captain's chair on the bridge, Q sat watching the view screen with an expression that no one who knew him would have recognized, because it was an expression he had not worn in 3 million years, since the last time the Continuum had tried and failed and concluded that some things could not be done. It was the expression of someone who was not certain of the outcome. For Q, it was the closest thing to hope that remained available. At 22:47 hours, with 13 minutes remaining before the Giant's cross-sections reached the Enterprise's position, Picard stood on his bridge and looked at the view screen and made the decision that he had been building towards since the moment Ensign Oseran had woken him with a transmission containing a sound that the universal translator could not classify. He had spent those intervening hours accumulating understanding with the methodical, wine-hungry precision of a man who knew that understanding was his only real instrument. Layering Data's physics onto Geordi's dimensional theory, onto Crusher's neurological findings, onto Troy's empathic observations, onto Q's ancient and reluctant testimony, until what he had was not a complete picture, because a complete picture was not available, and perhaps never would be. But something more valuable than a complete picture. He had a shape. He had the shape of what was happening, the contours of it, the essential nature of the encounter as best as mortal comprehension could trace it. And from that shape, he had drawn the only conclusion that the evidence supported. He could not negotiate with the giants. He could not reason with them or appeal to them, or explain humanity's presence in the galaxy to them in terms they would receive as explanation. He could not establish a treaty or propose a framework or invoke the Prime Directive or any of the thousand sophisticated instruments of Federation diplomacy that had been built over 2 centuries of contact with beings who were, however alien, beings, who had intentions that could be engaged, values that could be respected, needs that could be addressed. The giants were not beings in that sense, or if they were beings in the way that the ocean was a being, present, active, following the laws of their own nature, capable of interaction, but not capable of negotiation in any sense that the word had been built to carry. What he could do, what the evidence suggested was the only thing available, was be present with sufficient clarity and intentionality that the quality of the Enterprise's existence registered as something more than background signal. Not a message, a fact. The fact of 1,000 conscious minds choosing, deliberately and with full awareness, to turn towards something incomprehensible and remain open to it rather than closed. The fact of a species that was small and brief and fragile, and nevertheless could not stop reaching toward what it did not understand. Whether that fact would mean anything to the giants, whether meaning was a concept that applied, he did not know. He had stopped pretending he knew things he did not know approximately 6 hours ago, and he found the honesty clarifying rather than frightening. This was what he had. When this was what they were, it would either be sufficient or it would not, and he would face that outcome when it arrived. Report, he said. Deflector dish modification complete, Data said from Ops. The dish is calibrated to amplify and project the neurological harmonic series across all subspace bands in which the giant's cross-sections are detectable. Projected range of signal, sufficient to reach the outermost cross-section currently on approach. He paused. Captain, I want to note that this modification requires the deflector dish to operate in a mode it was not designed for, which means it cannot simultaneously maintain its standard navigational and shield support functions. The modification is either the deflector or the shields, not both. Lower the shields, Picard said. Worf's response was immediate and entirely professional, meaning he said nothing and complied, because Worf understood, better than most, the difference between tactical objection and operational insubordination, and understood further that Picard had already heard his objection 3 times in the past hour and had weighted against everything else and reached a conclusion. The shield indicator on Worf's console shifted from amber to dark, and the Enterprise sat in the dark of the Shackleton Expanse without its deflectors for the first time since their arrival, bare and present in the space between stars. Korath, Picard said, and the Klingon captain had remained on the Enterprise through the past hours with a stillness that Picard had come to interpret as the Klingon equivalent of deep engagement, the warrior's version of a scientist's focused attention. She stood near the tactical station with her arms at her sides and her jaw set and her eyes on the view screen with an expression that Picard recognized across the cultural distance between them as the expression of a warrior who had found an enemy she could not fight and was in the process of discovering what she was when fighting was not the available response. Your bird of prey, whatever her shield's current status, she has been running without shield since we decloaked, Korath said simply. A cloaking device and a shield grid cannot operate simultaneously. When we have been open to whatever this is since the moment we chose to stay. She paused. The House of Torath does not leave a battlefield? No, Picard said. I don't imagine it does. He turned to Troi. She was in her chair, her hands in her lap, her eyes carrying the divided quality of attention he had come to read as her managing the empathic presence carefully, keeping herself present on the bridge while maintaining awareness of the signal coming from outside. She looked at him and gave him a very small nod that said she was ready, and she was managing, and she was aware of the risk, and she had made her own decision about it. He turned to Data. Begin projection, he said. The deflector dish, which had spent years pushing aside micrometeorites and interstellar dust and the 1,000 small hazards of faster-than-light travel, it reconfigured itself in 4 seconds and began to do something it had not been built for and had no formal operational parameters for. Began to take the combined neurological harmonic output of over 1,000 conscious minds aboard the Enterprise, amplified and shaped by the calculations of the most sophisticated positronic brain in the Federation, and projected into the subspace bands where something incomprehensibly ancient moved through dimensions that human mathematics had only recently begun to suspect existed. It was not a broadcast in any conventional sense. It carried no encoded information, no linguistic content, no navigational data, no identification signal. It was, as Data had described it, a heartbeat, the specific irreducible signature of conscious existence, of minds that were finite and aware of their finitude, that had beginnings and would have endings, that experienced time as loss as well as gift, that knew what darkness was because they had learned what light was and could feel the difference, that were afraid and curious and determined and grieving and hopeful and present in their moment with the absolute complete totality of everything they were. All of that expressed into the dark towards something that had been here before the dark had a name. For 37 seconds, nothing happened. The view screen showed the 4 cross-sectional outlines continuing their convergence, unchanged in trajectory, unchanged in apparent velocity, unchanged in every measurable parameter. The ship's sensors reported exactly what they had been reporting. The harmonic presence that Troi was monitoring registered no change in quality or intensity. Q, like in Troy's chair, sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the view screen and said nothing, which remained the most alarming aspect of his entire appearance. For 37 seconds, the Enterprise expressed itself into the void and received nothing back. And Picard stood in front of his command chair and kept his breathing even and did not allow the silence to become the answer before it had finished being the question. On the 38th second, Troi said, "Oh." It was a very small word. It was the smallest word in the language, but the way she said it, the quality of breath behind it, the specific combination of wonder and impact, and the sound of a mind encountering something it had not been built for and finding that it was nevertheless, impossibly, inadequate to the encounter, caused every person on the bridge to turn toward her simultaneously with the focused urgency of people who had learned to treat her perceptions as instruments. Her eyes were very wide. Her hands were open in her lap, the way the incapacitated ensign's hands had been open, and Picard felt a spike of alarm that he controlled immediately because Troy's eyes were tracking present here. She was not being taken. She was receiving. "They hear us," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very level, and underneath the levelness was something oceanic. Not the frequency, not the signal. Us, the he quality, the specific quality of what it is to be this. Conscious and finite and reaching. She paused, her eyes still very wide, fixed on something that was not on the view screen. They have felt this before. Not like this. Not this clearly. Not this deliberately. But the echo of it. The background signal that Q described. They have been moving through a galaxy full of this quality for longer than... She stopped. Started again. They find it... Another stop. There is no word. The closest I can come is that there is a word in whatever constitutes their experience for what we are. And the word is very old, and it contains something that in their register of existence functions the way the color of a sunrise functions in ours. Something that is not necessary and not logical and not part of the structure of how the universe operates and is nevertheless... She paused. "Precious," she said finally, with the careful precision of a woman who knew the word was inadequate and had chosen it anyway because inadequate was what was available. We are precious to them the way a mayfly is precious to something that does not die. Not important, not significant. Precious. The bridge was completely silent. "They are not going to stop," Troy said. "They don't stop. Stopping is not part of what they are. They move, and they have always moved, and they will always move, and nothing about our presence is going to change that." She paused. "But they have turned toward us, in whatever way turning means for something that exists in their dimensions. They have oriented toward us the way you orient toward something that reminds you of something you had forgotten you valued." She looked at Picard. "They know we are here. They know we are trying. They know that we are small and that we are trying anyway." Another pause. "Honora, and they are." She pressed her lips together for a moment, and the professionalism of 11 years of Starfleet service held in her voice like a careful hand holding a very full cup. "They are glad," she said. "In whatever register, gladness exists for something like them. They are glad that we are here." Picard stood with this for a moment, stood with the knowledge that 4 beings old enough to predate the Q Continuum had turned toward the Enterprise the way you turn toward a sunrise. Not because the sunrise was powerful or significant or capable of altering the course of what you were doing, but because something in the quality of its existence reminded you that existence had a quality. That being here was not nothing. He thought about the 2 missing crew members from the Meridian. He thought about the 41 people in sickbay and 3 Klingon warriors participating in something vast. He thought about 11 members of the Q Continuum who had reached toward this 3 million years ago and had not come back. He thought about what Q had said about intention. "Counselor," he said carefully, "can you communicate anything in return? Not information, not language. Something equivalent. Something that carries the quality of what we are, rather than a message about what we are." Troy looked at him. "I've been doing that," she said quietly, "since the moment they turned toward us. Everything I am, everything on this ship, I've been expressing it back toward them as clearly as I can, without filtering, without diplomatic framing, without trying to make it comprehensible." She paused. "Just us, exactly as we are. Us, frightened and curious and determined and alive." "Is it working?" Riker asked. Troy was quiet for a moment. "Define working," she said gently. "They are not leaving. They are not causing harm. They are oriented toward us with something that functions like recognition, and something that functions like appreciation, and something that functions like..." She paused for a long time. "Like the decision to be careful. The way you are careful with something that is fragile and brief, not protected from, just held carefully." She looked at the view screen. "I don't think that's nothing." "No," Picard said quietly. "I don't think it's nothing either." The view screen showed the 4 cross-sections at their closest approach now, the stars bending wrong across 4 separate regions of the surrounding space, So the shapes defined by the absence of correct light, enormous and patient and present in a way that sensors could gesture toward but never fully capture. They were not still. They were still moving, still following whatever paths they followed through whatever dimensions they moved through, because that was their nature, and their nature did not pause for encounters any more than a river paused for a stone. But they were moving slowly, more slowly than before, and the trajectories, Data noted quietly from his console, had shifted, not away, not toward, but around, as though the giants were giving the small, bright, burning thing in the dark a wider berth, not avoiding, considering. The Meridian crew, Crusher said from the back of the bridge, where she had come to watch, her voice careful and controlled. The entrainment it's changing. Not decreasing, but reorienting. The harmonic they're generating is shifting in a way that my instruments read as voluntary, as though they are choosing, within whatever state they're in, to participate differently. She paused. As though they can feel what we're doing, and they're adding to it, contributing deliberately. They are part of it, Troy said. What we're projecting, they are part of what we're projecting. Their experience, what they've seen, what they've understood in whatever fragment of the giant's existence they've been able to perceive, that's woven into the signal. They are telling the giants about themselves from the inside. We are telling the giants about ourselves from the outside. She paused. It's more than either could do alone. Data looked up from his console with an expression of precise, had almost reverent attention. The cross-sections are maintaining their current trajectories, he said quietly. They will clear our position in approximately 22 minutes. They will not make direct contact with the ship. He paused. And Captain, the subspace harmonic signature I have been tracking since we began the projection. The ambient signal in this region of space, the background resonance produced by the giant's presence. Another pause. It has changed. The frequency has shifted by a margin that is small in absolute terms, but statistically unambiguous. It has incorporated something. The specific neurological harmonic of human consciousness has been woven into the ambient signature of this region of space. He looked at Picard. We have changed the sound of this place, not dramatically, not permanently perhaps. But for now, for some duration that I cannot calculate, the subspace signature of the Shackleton Expanse contains a thread of human consciousness. The giants have included us in whatever they express into the universe by simply being what they are. We are part of that expression now. The bridge absorbed this in complete silence. Q stood from Troy's chair. He stood slowly, which was itself an event of remarkable significance, because Q never moved slowly. Movement for Q was always instantaneous, a property of will rather than physics. He stood slowly, and he looked at the view screen, and his expression was something that Picard, who had spent years reading Q's performances for the truth beneath them, one identified as the specific complex emotion of a being who has witnessed something it had concluded was impossible and is experiencing the particular vertigo of having to revise a conclusion it has held for 3 million years. Well, Q said very quietly, how extraordinary. He looked at Picard for a moment with an expression that contained, beneath all its layers, something that was genuine and unperformed, and that Picard thought he would spend a considerable amount of time afterward trying to fully characterize. Then he was gone, with the absolute absence of transition that was his trademark. And the Enterprise bridge was left with its 1,000+ conscious minds and its lowered shields and its repurposed deflector dish and the slowly clearing cross-sections of 4 entities that had been here before the question of what was here could be asked, and the knowledge that somewhere in the subspace signature of the Shackleton Expanse, woven now into the ambient expression of things older than the concept of age, there was a thread of what it meant to be human, small and brief and burning and apparently precious. The giants left the way they had arrived, not departing exactly, because departure implied a relationship with origin and destination that did not apply to them, but rather continuing in whatever direction they moved through whatever dimensions governed them, their cross-sections drawing slowly back from the Enterprise's position over the course of the 40 minutes that followed their closest approach, the wrongness in the starfield gradually resolving back toward correctness, the bending of light around shapes that had no complete form in 3-dimensional space slowly releasing its hold on the surrounding geometry until the stars were, once again, simply stars. The sensors tracked them until they could not. Data monitored the cross-sectional positions with the focused, continuous attention of a scientist, watching a phenomenon recede and understanding that when it was gone, the measurements that remained would have to carry the entire weight of everything that had been learned, because there would be no second opportunity to verify. He tracked them at maximum resolution for 4 hours and 11 minutes after closest approach, until the last marginal occlusion at the edge of long-range sensor resolution resolved into ambiguity too profound to characterize as a reading. And then he sat at his console and looked at the accumulated data with the expression of a man beginning the first page of a book that will take the rest of his life to read. The Enterprise did not move for a long time after that. Picard had not ordered them to hold position. He had not ordered anything for a period of approximately 20 minutes after Q's departure and the Giant's slow recession, that Riker later noted in his personal log as the only time in 11 years of service that he had seen the captain appear to need the silence more than the ship needed direction. The crew, and with the particular sensitivity of people who had spent years learning to read Picard's relationship with significant moments, gave him the silence without being asked for it. They maintained their stations. They ran their systems checks. They did what they had been trained to do. They were good at what they had been trained to do. They were, Picard thought, looking at them from the elevated position of the command area, extraordinary at what they had been trained to do. And what they had been trained to do had not been adequate to this encounter in any of the ways that training was normally adequate, and they had found the gap between their training and the situation and had crossed it anyway, through a combination of scientific creativity and philosophical courage, and the particular quality of determined, curious openness that was, he allowed himself the thought, standing in the aftermath of something unprecedented, perhaps the most distinctly human contribution to the universe. Not the most powerful, not the most ancient, but present in a way that apparently mattered, even to things so old that the concept of mattering had predated them. Captain, it was Data from Ops. The Meridian crew. Picard turned. Report. The entrainment is resolving, Data said. As the Giant's cross-sections have moved beyond direct sensor range, the harmonic amplitude at which the Meridian crew's nervous systems were operating has been decreasing. The resonance is releasing. Gradually, and as far as I can determine, without any adverse neurological effects. He paused. Commander Brennan regained responsive consciousness approximately 8 minutes ago. Dr. Crusher is with her now. Picard was moving toward the turbo lift before Data had finished the sentence. Beverly Crusher had spent 11 years as the Enterprise's chief medical officer, developing what she privately thought of as her uncertainty face. The clinical expression she wore when a patient asked her a question she did not have a complete answer to, which conveyed honesty without inducing panic, which acknowledged the limits of medicine without undermining confidence in the physician. It was a carefully calibrated expression, and she wore it well. She was wearing it now, sitting on the edge of a biobed across from Commander Yael Brennan, who had been the first of the Meridian's crew to return to responsive consciousness, and who was sitting up with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of something warm in her hands, and the expression of a woman who had been somewhere far away for a very long time, and was still in the process of understanding that she had returned. Brennan was perhaps 40, with the particular quality of stillness that sometimes followed extended neurological events. Not shock, not confusion, but a careful interior quietness, as though the mind were taking inventory of itself and finding, to its own mild surprise, that everything was still there, just rearranged. She looked at Crusher with clear eyes and said, in the unhurried voice of someone who had recently had a complicated relationship with time, "Gee, how long?" "Approximately 16 hours, Crusher said. Brennan absorbed this. The others? Returning to consciousness over the past 20 minutes, all 41, all presenting the same neurological profile as you. Stable, intact, no evidence of injury. Crusher paused. How do you feel? Brennan thought about this with the specific, careful attention of someone who was not willing to give an automatic answer to the question. Different, she said finally. Not damaged, not traumatized. She turned the cup in her hands. I was a scientist for 12 years before Starfleet. Astrophysics. I spent 12 years trying to understand the large-scale structure of the universe, the geometry of it, The deep architecture that governs how everything relates to everything else at the largest scales. She paused. 9, I thought I had a reasonable picture. A working model. Not complete. No working model is complete, but sufficient. Sufficient to navigate by. She looked at her hands. I don't have that anymore. The model was wrong? Crusher asked. The model was... Brennan paused. The model was a drawing of a room that I made by looking through a keyhole, and then someone opened the door. She looked up. It wasn't frightening. I want you to know that. Whatever you saw from the outside, whatever the reading showed, it wasn't fear. It was the opposite of fear, I think. Fear is what you feel when you encounter something larger than you, and it threatens you. This was... She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. This was what you feel when you encounter something larger than you, and it acknowledges you. You know, when it makes room for the fact of you. She paused. I don't have the language. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, Crusher said quietly. I've been hearing variations of that sentence for the past hour. I think the language gap is universal. Picard arrived then, and Crusher gave him the room with the small, practiced step aside of someone who understands the difference between a medical conversation and a command one. He stood at the bio-bed and looked at Brennan with the focused, respectful attention he gave to people who had been somewhere he hadn't. Commander, he said, I'm Jean-Luc Picard, captain of the Enterprise. I know, Brennan said. I heard you from inside or wherever I was. I heard you talking. Not the words, but the quality of them, the intention behind them. She looked at him steadily. Whatever you did, the thing you said to them, the way you said it, it mattered. I could feel it mattering. She paused. Thank you. Picard held her gaze for a moment. Your crew mattered too, he said. What you contributed from inside. What you were able to express from the position you were in. Dr. Crusher tells me that your collective signal, combined with what the Enterprise was projecting, produced something neither could have generated independently. He paused. You were not passengers in what happened here. You were participants. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the cup in her hands and something shifted in her expression. Something that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, but contained properties of both. In the specific bittersweet quality of someone who has touched something beautiful and returned from it to the ordinary world and is in the process of deciding whether the ordinary world is a loss or a gift. The two members of my crew, she said quietly, Ensign Tavo and Lieutenant Park. Are they... We have not located them, Picard said, with the directness that the question deserved. There is no evidence of harm. There is evidence of displacement into dimensions we cannot directly observe. He paused. I will not tell you what that means for their safety, because I don't know. What I can tell you is that we are not treating it as a fatality. We are treating it as an unanswered question, and we will continue working on it. Brennan looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once. With the specific quality of a scientist receiving an honest negative result, not satisfied, but respecting the honesty. Unanswered questions are what we came here for, she said quietly. The debrief took 4 hours. Picard sat in the observation lounge with his senior staff and Korath and the recovered Commander Brennan and worked through everything they had, systematically and without rush, because the systematic working through of what had happened was itself important. Was the act of making it real, making it a part of the Federation's understanding of the universe, rather than a private, overwhelming experience that faded at the edges the way dreams faded. Data presented his full analysis, the higher dimensional topology model, the neurological harmonic framework, and the confirmation that the giant's frequency was woven into the subspace signature of the Shackleton Expanse. He presented it with the careful, comprehensive precision that was his natural mode, and that served, in this context, the additional function of anchoring everything in language and measurement in the structures of scientific understanding, which was its own kind of comfort in the aftermath of an encounter with something that had briefly made all of those structures feel very small. Troy contributed her empathic observations, documented with the precision she had maintained throughout, the orientation shift, the quality of recognition, the sense of careful preservation that the giants had expressed in the final moments of their closest approach. She presented it as data, bracketed throughout with appropriate epistemic humility. And the bracketing was honest rather than self-protective. She genuinely did not know with certainty what she had perceived. She knew what the perception had felt like, and she knew that it had been real, and she trusted Picard and her colleagues to receive that reality with the same careful respect with which she offered it. Crusher presented the neurological findings, the entrainment mechanism, the correlation data, the complete absence of injury across all 47 affected individuals. She presented with particular care the finding that the entrainment had resolved naturally as the giants moved away, and her assessment that this suggested the resonance was not coercive, that it was an opening, as Troy had called it, rather than a capture, that the Meridian crew had participated voluntarily in a sense that was meaningful, or even if the choice had been made at a level of cognition that bypassed ordinary decision-making. She was honest about the limits of her framework for making that assessment. She was also honest that she would be writing papers about this for the rest of her career. Korath sat through the entire debrief with the quality of attention she had maintained throughout the encounter. Absolute, focused, without performance. At the end, when Picard asked if she had anything to add, she was quiet for a moment in the specific way that Picard had come to recognize as a Klingon, formulating something carefully rather than simply speaking. "My first officer," she said finally, "and the two officers with him. When they recover," she paused, "I have been thinking about how I will write this in my report to the High Council. Much how I will describe what happened here in terms that the Council will receive as a military matter, which is the only frame they have available." She looked at the table. "I do not think this is a military matter." "No," Picard said. "I don't think it is." "I think it is something else," Korath said. "Something that does not have a category in Klingon strategic doctrine or Federation diplomatic protocol. Something that requires a category that does not yet exist." She looked at Picard with the directness that was her most consistent quality. "I would like to be part of building it." Picard looked at her for a moment. Then he looked around the table, at Riker's carefully managed expression, at Data's attentive stillness, at Crusher's exhausted precision, at Troy's divided and steady presence, at Brennan's quiet, rearranged gravity. "I intend to recommend to Starfleet Command," he said, "the establishment of a dedicated research program. Not a military program, not an intelligence program, a scientific and philosophical one, with the explicit mandate to develop the frameworks we don't yet have for understanding what we encountered here." He paused. "The frequency that the Meridian discovered, the neurological harmonic series, the higher dimensional topology, the nature of conscious existence as something that is perceivable and apparently meaningful to entities for whom nothing else about us is significant." He looked at Brennan. "Your crew opened a door, Commander. We are not going to close it." Brennan looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "we are not." 3 days later, the USS Pasteur arrived in the Shackleton Expanse with its specialized sensor equipment and its xenobiological research team and its relevant expertise, 18 hours late due to a navigational anomaly that its captain would spend considerable time explaining to Starfleet Command. It found the Enterprise waiting for it, its sensor logs filled with 11 terabytes of data that would occupy a generation of researchers. It found the Meridian's crew recovered and ambulatory and in the process of producing individual accounts that varied in language and metaphor, but converged with remarkable consistency on the same essential core. The experience of being seen by something vast and found, against all probability, to be worth seeing. It did not find the EK's Durasetla, which had departed 12 hours earlier, its captain having transmitted a formal farewell to Picard that was 3 sentences long, characteristically direct, and contained, in its final line almost as an afterthought, an invitation to share research findings through the back channels of the Khitomer Accord framework if Picard found the collaboration worthwhile. He found it worthwhile. The Pasteur also did not find, in the space where the giants had been, any direct evidence of their passage. No gravitational trace, no residual energy signature, no physical record of their presence that its instruments could detect. The space looked exactly as it had always looked. Ordinary deep space, dark and cold and scattered with the unremarkable light of distant stars. Except in the subspace bands that the Meridian had accidentally surveyed, I know in the specific harmonic series that Data had identified and spent 3 days documenting with the meticulous thoroughness that was his most reliable quality. There in those frequencies that Federation science had never thought to monitor, because it had never imagined there was anything to hear, the ambient signature of the Shackleton Expanse had changed. Something was woven into it now that had not been there before. A thread, a harmonic overtone of something finite and burning and briefly, brilliantly present in its moment. Something that a sufficiently sensitive instrument, calibrated to the right frequency band, could resolve as distinctly, unmistakably, stubbornly alive. The pastor's science team spent 6 hours arguing about whether it was real. Data had spent those same 6 hours preparing a paper demonstrating that it was. He had also spent 45 minutes of those 6 hours in his quarters, which was something he did not typically do, sitting in the silence of his own company and looking out the viewport at the ordinary dark and thinking, with no analytical purpose, with no output function active, simply thinking about what it meant to be finite, to be the kind of thing that had a beginning and would have an ending, to be the kind of thing that burned briefly and brightly in the dark and was apparently worth seeing. He did not reach a conclusion. He had not expected to. He had simply wanted to ask the question in the space where the giants had been, in case the asking was the kind of thing that mattered. In case the space was, in some frequency, band too fundamental for any instrument to fully capture. Still listening. The Shackleton Expanse continued its existence in the way that space continued its existence. Without interest in what had occurred within it, without memory, without the capacity for the kind of significance that the small burning things required in order to make meaning out of their brief passage through the dark. But the subspace signature remained. Data monitored it for months after the Enterprise departed, tracking it through periodic long-range sensor pings, documenting its gradual, almost imperceptible evolution as the harmonic thread of human consciousness settled into whatever permanent form it would take within the ambient expression of something incomprehensibly ancient. It did not fade. Now that was the finding he documented with the most care and the most precision and the most honest acknowledgement of what it meant. That the thing woven into the space where the giants had moved did not dissipate the way a signal dissipated, did not resolve back into background noise the way an anomaly resolved. It persisted. Whether the giants heard it, wherever their endless passage had taken them, whether hearing was a concept that applied, whether the thread of human consciousness woven into the subspace signature of a small region of the Shackleton Expanse registered in whatever constituted their experience. No instrument could say, and no instrument would say. Some questions were not the kind that instruments answered. Some questions were the kind that you asked into the dark and then lived with, not because the living with them was comfortable, but because the asking was itself the point. Because the reaching toward what could not be fully known was the most distinctly alive thing that a finite, brief, burning consciousness could do. The 2 missing crew members were never found. The question of where they were remained open. Picard kept it open deliberately, formally in the record, refused to file it as a loss, filed it instead as an ongoing inquiry. He visited their personnel files occasionally in the quiet hours, and thought about what it meant to be somewhere that sensors could not reach, participating in something that required everything a mind had in order to perceive even a fragment of it. He thought it was probably not the worst place to be. He thought that they, of all people, might understand that the door the Meridian had opened was not a door you simply walk back through. That some encounters changed the topology of the person who survived them, left them existing in a slightly different geometry than the one they had inhabited before, able to perceive frequencies they had not previously known the universe contained. He thought about this in the way he thought about the best and most important things, imprecisely, incompletely, and without resolution, which was to say that he thought about it the way a human being thought about something true. The universe was larger than the frameworks built to understand it. It had always been larger. The frameworks were not failures for being smaller. They were the reaching. The reaching was the point.